Welcome to Soft Mystic Stories. There is a people so feared that the greatest military machine in field built a wall just to keep them out. Not a fence, not a border post. A wall. 73 miles of stone, garrisoned by legions, bristling with watchtowers and fortified gates, stretching from coast to coast, across the width of an entire island. And even that wall, according to the Roman commanders who ordered it built, was not enough. The men on the other side of it were not like the other enemies Rome had faced. They didn't fight the way enemies were supposed to fight. They didn't wear armor the way enemies were supposed to wear armor. Some accounts suggest they didn't wear much of anything at all, charging into battle with bodies covered in swirling blue designs that Roman soldiers described in letters home with a kind of awe that bordered on fear. And then centuries after Rome left, centuries after Rome, those walls crumbled. Centuries after every other civilization that tried to understand them gave up. The Picts vanished, not conquered, not scattered, not absorbed into a slave population or exiled beyond some distant horizon. They just stopped being. The kingdom disappeared. The language disappeared. The very name disappeared from the records of the people who had once used it as their own. And what was left behind was a collection of carved stones so strange, so intricate, so filled with symbols nobody has ever been able to fully decode, that archaeologists are still arguing about them today. This is not a simple history. This is not the kind of story where a people rises, flourishes, and falls in a clean narrative arc that gets a few paragraphs in a school textbook. This is something stranger and older and darker than that. This is the story of a civilization that may have been in Britain before everyone else, that may have remembered things about this island that everyone else had forgotten and that chose, somehow, to leave almost nothing behind that we can read. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now, and what time is it? Let's start where almost no history starts, which is at the very beginning. Not the beginning of the Picts, specifically, because we don't actually know when they began. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know where their bloodline came from before the first Romans wrote down that strange Latin word pi and sent it back to the Senate in dispatches filled with barely concealed panic. What we do know is that when the Romans arrived in Britain in 43 AD, under Emperor Claudius, the island was already old, ferociously, incomprehensibly old in terms of human settlement. People had been living on that island for hundreds of thousands of years. They had survived ice ages. They had watched sea levels rise and sever Britain from the European mainland around 8,000 years ago, turning it from a peninsula into an island and cutting its people off from whatever was happening on the continent. They had built Stonehenge. They had built the Ring of Brodgar in what is now Orkney, a monument so precisely laid out that modern surveyors have measured it and shaken their heads. They had buried their dead in elaborate long barrows oriented to catch the light of the winter solstice sun, which means they were tracking astronomical events with enough precision to predict where the sun would rise on a specific day of the year. These were not primitive people. These were people who had been studying the sky from this island for so long that the sky and the stone and the dead were all woven into the same continuous fabric of understanding. The question that haunts every serious archaeologist who works on British prehistory is a simple one. What happened to those people? Where did they go when the Celts arrived? When the Romans arrived? When the Anglo-Saxons arrived? When the Normans arrived? Wave after wave of newcomers who all left names and languages and records. The answer that the evidence keeps pushing toward uncomfortably is that they didn't avail. So, they stayed. And in the far north of Britain, in the rugged highlands and islands that nobody wanted badly enough to fight hard for, a portion of them may have survived long enough to become what the Romans eventually called the Picts. This is not a fringe theory. Genetic studies conducted in the last 2 decades have produced results that surprised even the researchers who ran them. Modern populations in parts of Scotland, and particularly in the northern and western Isles, carry a genetic signature that doesn't match the waves of migration we know about. It doesn't match the Celtic migrations. It doesn't match the Anglo-Saxon expansions. It points towards something older, something that was already present on the island before the Bronze Age, before the Iron Age, before any of the named peoples of British history arrived and started carving their names into the record. There is a deep population in Britain that predates everything we usually talk about when we talk about British history. And the Picts may have been the last major expression of that deep population, the last people who still remembered what Britain was before it became what it is now. That changes how you hear everything that follows, because when you read Roman accounts of the Picts, accounts written by men who had conquered most of the known world, accounts that described these northern fighters with a peculiar mixture of military contempt and genuine unease, you are not reading about a barbarian tribe that hadn't yet been civilized. You are reading about an extremely ancient people responding to an invasion with the accumulated fury of thousands of years of occupying the same ground. The Romans arrived in Britain, fully expecting to do what they had done everywhere else. They expected to fight some initial battles, absorb the local elites into the Roman administrative structure, build some roads and forts, and eventually turn the whole island into a productive province. That's what they had done in Gaul. That's what they had done in Spain and North Africa and the Near East. The formula worked. It had worked for centuries. Britain would be the same. It wasn't the same. The southern tribes, the Iceni, the Trinantes, the Catavaloni, these Celtic peoples gave the Romans trouble. Boudicca, revolt in 60 or 61 AD, came within a real distance of destroying the Roman province entirely. But eventually the south was pacified. Eventually, the Romans built their roads and their towns and their villas and their bathus, and it started to look, at least superficially, like any other corner of the empire. But the north was different, and the further north the Roman legions pushed, the more different it got. The Roman general, Guinea's Julius Agricola, led a series of campaigns into what is now Scotland, beginning around 77 AD. He pushed further north than any Roman commander before him. He claimed victories. His son-in-law, the historian Tacitus, wrote about these campaigns in a biography of Agria that is one of our main sources for this period. And in that text, Tacitus describes something remarkable. At a place called Mons Grappius, which has never been definitively located, but was somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, Agricola's forces met a Caledonian army, and the Caledonian leader gave a speech. Tacitus was not there. He was writing based on what his father-in-law told him, filtered through the conventions of Roman historical writing, which meant putting dramatic speeches into the mouths of important figures. But the content of that speech, even allowing for all of that, is striking. The Caledonian leader, whose name Tacitus records as Calgicus, is made to say something that has echoed through history for nearly 2,000 years. He tells his warriors that they are the last free people, that beyond them there is nothing, only waves and rocks, and the Romans, even the sea does not protect you from. And he says the words that nobody who has encountered them has ever been able to forget. They create a wasteland, and they call it peace, in Latin, solitudinum fat pes appellant. Now, Tacitus invented that speech, or at least he heavily shaped it. The fact that he put those words specifically into the mouth of a northern British warrior, the fact that even a Roman writer, writing for a Roman audience, saw fit to give voice to the tubes, perspective of the people fighting against Rome, tells you something about what those people represented in the Roman imagination. They were not just another enemy, they were the edge of the world. They were the people who refused. Griella claimed to have won a decisive victory at Mons Grappius. Tacitus dutifully recorded this claim. But here is what happened next, and this is the detail that gets quietly glossed over in the triumphalist version of the story. The Romans didn't stay. Agricola's forces pushed north, reached somewhere near the tip of Scotland, maybe even circled the island by sea, and then they came back south. Not because they had finished the job, because the job couldn't be finished. The legions were needed elsewhere in the empire. The garrison lines had to be maintained closer to the south, and the north, with its impossible terrain and its people, who seemed to melt into the hills, and return when they were least expected, was not worth the cost of holding it. A generation after Agricola's campaigns, the Romans began building a permanent solution to the northern problem. Emperor Hadrian visited Britain in 1222 AD and ordered the construction of a wall across the narrow waste of northern England. Hadrian's wall, 73 miles, 15 feet high, in places with a fort every 5 miles and a small fortlet every mile, and watchtowers between each fortlet, with a ditch to the north and a second earthwork to the south, with a road running the entire length. This was not a cheap construction. This was not something you built because the people on the other side of it were a manageable nuisance. You build something like this when you have concluded that the alternative is worse. But even Hadrian's wall was not the whole story. 2 decades after it was built, Emperor Antoninus Pius ordered another wall further north, cutting across the central belt of what is now Scotland. The Antonine Wall, built in turf and timber rather than stone, running for 37 miles from the Firth of Forth to the Firth of Clyde. The Romans occupied this further north position for about 2 decades, and then they abandoned it and retreated to Hadrian's Wall. The north had refused them again. The people the Romans were trying to keep out of the south with all of this construction were not, at this point, called Picts. That name doesn't appear in the written record until 297 AD, in a panegyric, a formal speech of praise addressed to the Emperor Constantius Thyrsus. The speaker refers to the Caledonians and other Picts, treating it almost as a general term for the painted or tattooed peoples of the far north. Within a generation, Picts had become the standard Latin term for these people, but the people themselves had been there the whole time. The name was new, the people were ancient. So who exactly were they? Where were they in the British landscape before the Romans gave them this Latin label? The answer is frustratingly diffuse. The Roman and Greek geographers who described Britain in the centuries before and after the conquest mentioned a bewildering array of tribal names in the northern regions: the Caledoni, the Vacamagi, the Tauli, the Veniconese, the Smee, the Caron. Dozens of names scattered across the map of northern Britain in the ancient sources, each presumably representing a distinct people or confederation of people with their own territory and their own leadership. By the time the name Picts appears and begins to be used consistently, many of these separate entities seem to have coalesced into something more unified, not a single kingdom, at least not yet, but a recognized grouping of peoples who shared enough cultural identity that outsiders could use one word to refer to all of them. This is not unusual in the history of peoples emerging from a period of external pressure. The Romans had been pressing on the northern frontier for generations. That kind of sustained external pressure has a way of forcing previously separate groups to recognize what they have in common and organize accordingly. The Picts, who terrified the post-Roman world, were probably in part a product of Roman pressure, a political formation that crystallized in response to the constant threat from the south. But they were built from older materials. They were built from the peoples who had always been there. And what those peoples had in common, underneath all the different tribal names and territorial boundaries, seems to have been a set of cultural practices that set them apart from every other group in Britain. A distinct language, a distinct artistic tradition, and most importantly for their reputation in the ancient sources, a distinctive approach to the body and to warfare that made Roman soldiers write home about them in terms that mixed contempt with something that looked very much like awe. Let's talk about the tattoos, or the paint, or whatever it actually was, because this is one of the genuine mysteries of Pictish history, and it's more complicated than the word Picts implies. The Latin word pictus means painted, and the name Picti almost certainly derives from this, referring to people who marked their bodies in some way. But exactly how they marked their bodies, and with what, and what those marks meant, is a question that has never been fully answered. Julius Caesar, writing about his earlier expedition to Britain in 55 and 54 BC, wrote that all that Britain dye themselves with W gives a blue color, and this makes them look very frightening in fifth battle. W is a plant that produces a blue dye when the leaves are fermented. It's real. It grows in Europe. It was definitely known to Iron Age peoples. But here is the problem with Caesar's account. W doesn't tattoo, it stains skin temporarily, and the effect when you rub W on your skin is not actually very dramatic. Various experimental archaeologists and historical enthusiasts have tried it. It doesn't taste. It produced the vivid, terrifying blue warrior effect that Caesar and later sources describe. It produces something more like a grayish stain that washes off in a few days. So either the ancient sources were exaggerating for effect, which is entirely possible, or they were describing something other than simple wet body paint. And this is where it gets interesting, because tattooing is actually much harder to do than painting. And the archaeological evidence for tattooing in Iron Age Europe is limited but real. The Iceman Ötzi found preserved in an alpine glacier and dating to around 3300 BC had tattoos, not decorative ones, but marks placed on specific points of his body that correspond to acupressure points and may have been therapeutic. The Scions, the great steppe nomads who interacted with peoples across a vast arc from the Black Sea to Central Asia, were tattooed. Herodotus mentions it. The point is that tattooing was not unknown in prehistoric Europe. It was practiced, and the people in the far north of Britain, with their extremely long cultural continuity going back potentially thousands of years, may have been practicing a form of it. Later medieval Irish sources, writing about the Picts from the outside, described them as having marks cut into their flesh, not painted on, cut in, and then having pigment rubbed into the cuts. This is exactly how traditional tattooing works in many cultures around the world. You break the skin, you introduce pigment, the pigment is trapped in the healed tissue. If Pictish warriors were doing this, if the blue designs that Roman and post-Roman sources describe were actually subcutaneous, actually permanent marks carved into the body, then they were practicing something that Roman soldiers genuinely had never seen before, and that would have looked deeply, profoundly alien in the context of ancient Mediterranean warfare. But there's another possibility that recent scholarship has started taking seriously, which is that the Picts were using both, that the permanent tattoos were reserved for specific ritual or status contexts, that warriors added painted designs over, and sometimes incorporating the tattoos when going into battle, and that the cumulative effect of permanent body art combined with fresh paint, combined with whatever other preparations a Pictish warrior made before combat, produced something that was genuinely otherworldly to eyes trained on Roman military dress. Because Roman soldiers wore armor, they wore helmets, they wore standardized kit designed to present a uniform, imposing disciplined face to any enemy. And then they encountered people who wore almost nothing, whose entire body had been turned into a statement, whose skin was not skin in the ordinary sense, but a surface covered in designs that had meaning, that told a story, that said something about who this person was, and what they had survived, and what they were capable of. The disorientation was probably psychological as much as physical, and psychological disorientation in battle is deadly. This is one of the things that the Roman sources, even allowing for all their cultural bias and all their rhetorical exaggeration, keep coming back to. The Picts were frightening in a way that went beyond military capability. They were frightening in a way that had to do with how they looked, how they moved, what they appeared to be. The word barbarian in Roman usage meant simply foreign, not Roman, not civilized in the Roman sense. But the way Roman writers talk about the northern Britons has an extra edge that the word barbarian alone doesn't capture. These were people who seemed to Roman eyes to be living outside the categories that organized the Roman world, outside the categories of soldier and civilian, outside the categories of human and something older and stranger. Now there is a long history of the powerful, demonizing the people who successfully resist them. Rome did it everywhere. The British did it to indigenous peoples across their own empire, centuries later. The pattern is familiar enough that we should be careful about taking the Roman characterization of the Picts at face value. But the pattern of behavior that the Roman sources describe, the specific way the Picts fought and lived, and refused to submit, That pattern is consistent, enough across enough different sources that it tells us something real about how these people chose to present themselves to the world. And what it tells us is that the Picts were not trying to intimidate Rome through conventional, military means. They weren't meeting Roman legions on open ground and trying to outsoldier them. The legions were better at that game, and the Picts knew it. Instead, the PS seemed to have adopted a strategy that modern military theorists would recognize as asymmetric warfare taken to a cultural extreme. They were fighting on a terrain that the Romans couldn't follow them onto. Not just the physical terrain of the highlands, although that was important, but the psychological terrain, the terrain of myth and fear and the uncanny. You can't fight a people if every encounter with them leaves your soldiers shaken in ways they can't fully explain. You can't pacify a territory if the people defending it are doing so in ways that seem to operate by different rules than the ones you understand. The Roman military machine was brilliant at solving problems that looked like Roman problems. The Picts consistently managed to present problems that didn't look like Roman problems. And that is why, in the end, Rome never took the north. Let's step forward now, past the Roman period, into the centuries that follow, because the story of the Picts doesn't end with Rome's departure from Britain. In some ways, it barely begins there. The Romans left Britain in stages over the course of the late 4th and early 5th centuries, pulled back to defend the heartland of the empire against pressures from multiple directions. The last Roman troops left the island around 410 AD, when Emperor Honorius famously, or possibly, apocryphally, told the cities of Britain to look to their own defenses. And what followed was not a vacuum. It was a period of enormous turbulent transformation that we tend to call the Dark Ages because the written record thins out so dramatically, but that we should probably call something more like the Age of Chaos, because that is what it actually was. Into the post-Roman chaos came the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic peoples from what is now northern Germany and Denmark, crossing the North Sea in boats and beginning to settle the eastern and southern parts of Britain. They came gradually over generations, and as they expanded westward and northward, they pushed the existing Celtic-speaking populations into the extremities of the island, Cornwall, Wales, western Scotland. The political map of Britain was being redrawn at speed in blood, and with no certainty about what the final picture would look like. The Picts in the north were not passive observers of this transformation. They were active players, freed from the Roman pressure that had defined their political existence for 3.5 centuries. The Pictish kingdoms, and by this period there were multiple kingdoms, recognizably Pictish, in the north, began to expand their influence. They raided south, they formed alliances, and broke them. They fought the Irish settlers, who had established a kingdom called Dal Riata in what is now Argyll, and who would eventually give Scotland its name. They interacted with the incoming Anglian kingdom of Northumbria, which was pushing northward along the eastern coast, and they did all of this while maintaining a distinct identity, a distinct language, a distinct culture that refused to be dissolved into any of the other identities competing for space in post-Roman Britain. The most dramatic episode of this period from the Pictish perspective happened in 685 AD. It is one of those moments in history that didn't look like a turning point when it happened, but in retrospect changed everything. A Northumbrian king called Ecgfr decided to push north across what had been the rough boundary between his kingdom and Pictish territory. He had good reasons to be confident. Northumbria was at this point one of the most powerful kingdoms in Britain. It had a formidable military. Ecgfr himself was an experienced war leader who had fought successful campaigns against the Irish and the Means. He led his army north into Pictish territory, somewhere into the area we now call Angus or Luck, Perthshire, pursuing a Pictish force that was retreating before him. He was being led into a trap. The Pictish king at this time was called Bridair MacBilly, and Bridair was by any measure one of the most effective military commanders in the early medieval British Isles. He had spent years consolidating Pictish power, bringing the disparate Pictish kingdoms under a stronger central authority, and he had been watching Northumbrian expansion with clear eyes. He knew he couldn't match ECF in an open-field battle, so he didn't try to. He retreated, drawing Ecgfr into Pictish territory, into terrain that the Northumbrians didn't know and the Picts knew intimately. And then, at a place called Nectanmere, near the modern town of Fufa, he stopped retreating and turned. We don't have a detailed account of the battle. The sources are sparse and sometimes contradictory. What we know is the outcome. ECF was killed. His army was destroyed. The Northumbrian advance northward was broken completely and permanently. Within a generation, Northumbria had retreated to roughly the line it had held before Ecgfr's expedition, and it never again posed a serious military threat to the Pictish kingdoms. The Battle of Nectanmere didn't just stop one invasion. It redrew the political geography of northern Britain in a way that would prove permanent. And it established something important about who the Picts were militarily. They were not simply reactive. They were not simply defenders of their territory, waiting to be attacked and then repelling the attacker. They were strategic. They were patient. Bride MacBilly had apparently allowed Northumbrian expansion to build up pressure, allowed it to reach the point where Ecgfr felt confident enough to commit fully to a deep penetration of Pictish territory, and then he had sprung the trap at exactly the right moment. This is not the behavior of a culture that operates purely on instinct or aggression. This is the behavior of a culture with sophisticated military thinking and the discipline to execute a complex plan. Now, here is the point in the story where I want to step back from the military narrative and talk about something that doesn't get enough attention when people discuss the Picts, because the Tory were not primarily a military phenomenon. They were primarily an artistic phenomenon, and the art they left behind is one of the most extraordinary and one of the most mysterious bodies of work in European history. There are scattered across Scotland roughly 200 surviving stones that scholars call Pictish, symbol stones. They range in size from small portable slabs to massive standing monuments. They date based on their style and the context in which they were found, from roughly the 4th century AD through to the 9th century, with the bulk of them coming from what appears to be the peak of Pictish civilization in the 7th and 8th centuries, and they are covered in symbols. Some of the symbols are figurative. There are animals, most famously an extraordinarily elegant swimming creature that archaeologists call the Pictish beast, though they debate endlessly about whether it's supposed to represent a real animal or a mythological one. There are horses and deer and eagles and salmon and wolves and boars, all rendered with a stylistic assurance and a mastery of proportion and movement that is technically remarkable for any period. The horses in particular, the way they're shown at the gallop, with a kind of fluid energy that suggests the artist had spent a great deal of time watching real horses move. These are not primitive representations. These are the work of a tradition that had developed over a long time, but it's the abstract symbols that make the Pictish stones genuinely unique in the entire corpus of early medieval art. There are symbols that appear over and over again on stone after stone across a geographical range of several hundred miles. A crescent and a V-rod, a double disc, connected by a Z-rod, a mirror, a comb, an object that looks vaguely like a tuning fork, a thing that resembles a notched rectangle, a shape described by some scholars as a swimming elephant, and by others as something else entirely. These symbols appear in consistent combinations, carved with consistent technique, across a period of several centuries, and across the full extent of Pictish territory. They are, by any reasonable definition, a writing system, or at least a signaling system, a set of signs with specific reference, used in specific context to convey specific information, and nobody has ever deciphered them. This is not for lack of trying. Scholars have been working on the Pictish symbols since the Victorian period, when they were first seriously catalogued. In the 20th century, the approach became more rigorous and quantitative. Researchers have counted how often each symbol appears, which symbols appear together, which combinations are common, and which are rare, what context the stones were found in, and what that might tell us about their function. Modern computational approaches have applied statistical methods to the problem, treating the symbol sequences as a corpus of data and trying to extract patterns that might reveal underlying meaning. What these analyses have established is actually quite a lot. The symbols are definitely not random. They appear in consistent pairings and sequences that follow rules. Rules that the people who made them clearly understood, even if we don't. The overall structure of the symbol system, the way pairs of symbols appear together, the way certain symbols seem to function as qualifiers for other symbols, the overall distributional pattern, all of this has statistical properties that look like language. Real language, not decoration, not purely heraldic marking, something that worked the way writing works, conveying structured information to people who knew the code. What the analyses have not established is what any specific symbol means. The breakthrough that would let someone stand in front of a Pictish stone and say this symbol means this thing, and this combination means this phrase, and this stone says this particular thing about this particular person. That breakthrough hasn't yet happened, and it may never happen because we have no Pictish Rosetta Stone. We have no text where the same content is given in both the Pictish symbol system and in a language we can read. Every attempt to decode the symbols has ultimately run into the same wall, which is that you can identify the formal properties of the system. You can describe how it works structurally, but without a known language gloss you cannot get from structure to meaning. This is frustrating in a way that goes beyond the academic. It means that the Pict who clearly had something to say, who clearly used these symbols to say, with enormous care and skill, and over a very long period of time, have been saying it into a void. As far as we are concerned, we can see the words. We cannot hear the voice. The stones were not purely abstract communication devices, though. The figurative panels on the later stones, the ones that scholars call class the round and class 3 Pictish stones, are extraordinarily elaborate compositions that combine the abstract symbols with scenes from what appear to be myths or rituals or historical events, or all three, at once in ways we can't fully disentangle. One of the most famous is the Hilton of Cadboll stone, found on the Black Isle in the Scottish Perth Highlands, and now preserved in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. It's a large slab of sandstone, and the panel that survives intact shows a woman on horseback side, saddle, surrounded by hunting scenes, with hounds and horsemen, framed by an elaborate vine, scroll inhabited by birds and animals, and in the corner below her, a pair of Pictish abstract symbols, including a mirror and a comb. The woman on the Hilton of Cadboll stone has always drawn attention because she'd cark as someone important. She's the central figure. She's shown in a position of authority or dignity. The symbols associated with her, particularly the mirror and comb, appear on a number of stones associated with high-status women in Pictish contexts, and some scholars have interpreted them as markers of female identity or female power, which raises an interesting question about Pictish society. What role did women play? The answer from the scattered evidence we have is a complicated one. Medieval Irish and Scottish sources that discuss Pictish succession contain something deeply unusual by the standards of early medieval Europe, a system of matrilineal succession. The kingdom passed not from father to son, but through the female line, with kings being the sons of royal mothers rather than the sons of royal fathers. This is so unusual in the context of early medieval Northern Europe that some historians have disputed it, arguing that the sources are confused, or that the matrilineal system applied only in specific circumstances. But the pattern is consistent enough in enough different sources that most scholars now accept that there was something real here, even if the precise workings of the system are unclear. Matrilineal succession would have given Pictish royal women an importance and a leverage in much of each other's political life that was unusual in the early medieval world. If your son's claim to power came through you, then you were the fulcrum of dynastic politics in a way that patrilineal systems didn't allow. The woman on the Hilton of Cadboll stone sitting her horse with authority at the center of a stone that was clearly made for someone important, maybe expressing exactly this kind of power. She may be the person through whom the claim to power ran, and the stone may be commemorating her in a way that the people who made it and the people who saw it would have understood completely, and that we can only partially reconstruct. There is another element of Pictish culture that gets even less attention than the stones but is the element that is not there, the literary element. The Picts left no texts. Not one surviving manuscript can be attributed to Pictish authorship. Not one surviving text in the Pictish language which we know existed because it is briefly referenced in medieval sources. Not one saga or law code or religious text or history in Pictish. The Irish had the Book of Kells and the Book of Arming and the Annals of Ulster and dozens of other manuscripts. The Northumbrians had Bede. Even the pagan Anglo-Saxons eventually left texts. The Picts left stones. Why? This is a question that doesn't get asked enough. The Picts were in contact with the literate world for centuries. They knew about writing. They had Christian churches by at least the 6th century, probably earlier, and those churches were in contact with the broader Christian manuscript tradition. Some Pictish clergy must have been able to read and write Latin, and yet no Pictish literature survives. Almost no Pish texts of any kind survive. A handful of names in king lists, a handful of glosses, that's essentially it. One possibility is that Pictish texts existed and were destroyed deliberately or otherwise, in the upheavals that attended the end of the Pictish kingdom. There are certainly historical examples of conquerors destroying the literary heritage of the peoples they absorbed. Another possibility is that the Picts were deliberate in their choice to encode important information in stone rather than on vellum, that the symbol stones represent a conscious choice to communicate in a medium that would last, literally carved in rock, rather than in the fragile medium of manuscript, which could be burned, or rot, or be carried away. This would explain a great deal, including why the stones seem to be doing the work that in other early medieval cultures was done by texts, commemorating the dead, marking boundaries, recording genealogies, expressing theological statements. But it also means that what the Picts chose to preserve, and what they chose not to preserve, tells us something about their priorities. The visual language was paramount. The spoken language was presumably rich and complex, and capable of the full range of human expression. The written language, if it ever fully developed, beyond the symbol system, was either not important to them, or was important in ways that didn't survive. And this matters because it means that most of what we know or think we know about the Picts comes from their enemies, their neighbors, and their successors. It comes from Roman sources that were trying to justify military decisions. It comes from Irish annals that were tracking events in Pictish territory from the outside. It comes from later Scottish and English chronicles that were in many cases actively hostile to Pictish memory. It comes from Bede, the great Northumbrian monk, who wrote in the early 8th century, and who includes information about the Picts in his ecclesiastical history of the English people, but who was writing from a perspective shaped by the political and ecclesiastical rivalries of his own time and place. None of these sources are wrong exactly. They're not fabrications, but they're all telling the Pictish story from somewhere else through lenses ground by someone else's purposes. And the Picts themselves, the one group who could have corrected the record, left us the stones and the silence. Let's go deeper into the landscape now, because the landscape of Pictish Scotland is not incidental to the story. It is the story in a very real sense. The geography of the region shapes everything: the political boundaries, the military strategy, the agricultural possibilities, the trade routes, the cultural contacts, and the Pictish landscape is one of the most dramatically varied, and in many ways, the most extreme landscapes in Britain. The core of Pictish territory, the area where the symbol stones are densest, and where the most powerful Pictish kingdoms seem to have been located, was in what is now the northeast of Scotland. Aberdinia, Angus, Perth, the Moray Firth coast. These are not inhospitable places. They have fertile river valleys, productive agricultural land, access to the sea. The Pictish heartland was capable of supporting a reasonably dense population by early, medieval standards, and the evidence of the symbol stones, which required significant skill and resources to produce, suggests that population was organized enough and wealthy enough to support specialist craftspeople. But Pictish territory extended far beyond this core. It extended north into Caithness and Southernthorland, where the landscape becomes something else entirely. Open moorland, dramatic coastal cliffs, a sky that seems larger than anywhere else in Britain, a land where the evidence of human occupation, going back thousands of years, is almost overwhelming. The Brocks of the far north, those extraordinary circular stone towers built by Iron Age peoples, some of them 2,000 years old and still standing, are part of the landscape that the Picts inherited and in some cases continued to use. They extended west into Rossan Cromarty and eventually into contact with the Dalriata Irish, settlers in Argyll. They extended to the islands, Orkney, Shetland, the Outer Heads. The Orkney Islands deserve special attention. They are, in terms of the density and preservation of prehistoric monuments, perhaps the most remarkable landscape in the whole of Europe. My show, the Great Chambered Tomb built around 2700 BC, oriented precisely to the mid-winter solstice, so that the setting sun illuminates the central chamber for only a few days around the shortest day of the year. The stones of Stennis, a circle of monoliths erected around the same period. The Ring of Broadgar, slightly later, a massive henge monument containing 60 stones originally, of which 36 survive, precisely circular, surrounded by a ditch cut into solid rock. Scarabra, the Neolithic village buried under sand dunes and preserved almost miraculously, with stone furniture still in place, in houses that were occupied 4,500 years ago. These monuments were there when the Picts were there. They were thousands of years old when the Picts were living in the islands and carving their limbs onto stone, and the Picts were not indifferent to them. There is evidence that Pictish people left carvings in some of these ancient monuments, including notably in Mishoa, where Viking raiders carved runic inscriptions centuries later, but where there are also marks of an earlier kind. The ancient monuments were part of the Pictish landscape in a way that went beyond merely coexisting with them. They were objects of attention, places of significance, woven into a world of meaning that we can barely reconstruct. This is one of the things that most distinguishes the Picts from the other major peoples of early world, medieval Britain. The Northumbrians, the Mercians, the West Saxons. These kingdoms were in large part built from immigrant populations, people who had come to Britain within the last few centuries and who were still in the process of developing their relationship with the landscape they had settled. The Picts were the other thing. They were the landscape. They were the continuation of a human presence that had been unbroken in those specific places for potentially thousands of years. And they were surrounded by the physical evidence of that presence, by the tombs and the circles and the standing stones of their predecessors, some of whom may have been their literal ancestors. What did they make of those monuments? What stories did they tell about them? What rituals, if any, were connected to them? We don't know. But the fact that the Picts produced their own monument tradition, the symbol stones, in the same landscape as all of these far older monuments, suggests that they were not simply ignoring this context. They were placing their own marks in a world already full of marks. And whether they understood what those older marks meant or not, they were in dialogue with them. They were adding new chapters to a very long book. Now I want to talk about the religious dimension of Pictish civilization, because this is where some of the most interesting and least resolved questions live. The received story is that the Picts were pagans until a missionary saint converted them after, which they became Christian, and all was well. The received story even has a specific candidate for the missionary saint, Columba, the Irish monk who founded the monastery of Iona in 563 AD, and who, according to his biographer, Adam Nan, made at least one journey into Pictish territory and had various dramatic encounters there, including confronting a king called Brid at his stronghold near what is now Inverness. The Columbus story is one of the most famous missionary narratives in early medieval history, and it's a good story. But historians have spent decades unpicking it and discovering that it's more complicated than it looks. For one thing, Christianity had almost certainly reached some parts of Pictish territory before Columbus arrived. A saint called Ninian is said to have established a church at Wythorn in what is now Galloway, in Montserrat, the late 4th or early 5th century, and there are traditions connecting his missionary work to peoples in the north. The details are murky, and the sources are late, but the underlying point that Christianity was working its way into northern Britain before Columbus came along is probably correct. More importantly, the question of what Christianity meant to the Picts, what happened to their pre-existing religious practices when they formally adopted the new faith, is one that the sources are almost completely silent about. We know from the symbol stones that something profoundly important to Pictish culture continued to be expressed visually well into the Christian period. The later Class II stones, which are explicitly Christian in many respects, with elaborate crosses and biblical scenes, also continue to carry the traditional Pictish abstract symbols. The Christian content and the pre-Christian symbolic language appear together on the same stones, as if the people who commissioned and made them saw no contradiction between the two systems. This is actually quite common in the history of conversion, especially in the early medieval period. Christianity spread into pagan cultures and absorbed aspects of those cultures, and the cultures absorbed aspects of Christianity, and the resulting synthesis was often very different from what the missionaries had in mind. What makes the Pictish case interesting is that the synthesis seems to have been particularly deep and long-lasting. The symbol system doesn't disappear when Christianity arrives. It continues for another 2 centuries or more, apparently remaining meaningful, apparently continuing to convey information that the Pictish people found important to convey. Whatever those symbols mean, whatever they were saying it in a Christian, Pictish world, as well as in whatever kind of world preceded it. There is one piece of evidence about Pictish religion that I want to give more attention than it usually gets, because it points toward a dimension of Pictish spiritual life that the more familiar narratives tend to skip past. In some early medieval sources, including some Irish annals and some later Scottish texts, there are references to Pictish Druids, not just Druids as a historical category, as in the Druids who existed in pre-Roman Iron Age Britain and Gaul, but Druids still active and significant in a Pictish context well into the early medieval period. These references are not well understood. Scholars debate whether the word Druid in these contexts means the same thing it meant in Caesar's accounts of Guish religion, or whether it has shifted in meaning, or whether it's being used loosely to describe a class of religious specialists, without implying a direct continuity with the Iron Age tradition. But the fact that these references exist, the fact that the word is being used in connection with Pictish religious practice in sources that date from after the official Christianization of the Picts, suggests something important. It suggests that the transition from pre-Christian to Christian religion in Pictish territory was not a clean break. It was a negotiation, a process, a layering of new meanings over old structures, and the old structures were robust enough to leave traces in texts that were written by people who had no interest in celebrating them. The Druids, in the classical Iron Age world, were not simply priests. They were a class of specialists who combined religious function with legal function, intellectual function, medical function, and the function of cultural memory. They were the people who remembered everything, who held in their minds and in their trained memory systems the accumulated knowledge of the culture, who served as teachers and judges and divers and storytellers. In a culture that deliberately chose not to write things down as the classical sources, say the Druids did, the memory specialists were the library. Everything of importance was encoded in their trained, disciplined, professionally cultivated memories. If something like this tradition persisted into the Pictish period, and the evidence, scattered and ambiguous as it is, suggests that it may have, then it changes how we understand the symbol system. The symbols may have been the external, publicly visible edge of a much larger system of specialized knowledge that was maintained orally by specialists, that was performed transmitted in ways that left no physical trace, that existed in the minds of the people who held Pictish culture together and died with them when the culture died. The stones are what survived, because stone survives. The living library did not survive, because living libraries don't. This is speculation, and I want to be honest about that. We are in territory here where the evidence is thin, and the imagination is needed to span the gaps. But it's not empty speculation. It's speculation grounded in what we know about how similar cultures in similar periods maintained and transmitted knowledge. And it suggests that what we have lost in the disappearance of the Picts is not just a language and a political entity. It may be an entire intellectual tradition, a way of understanding the world that was built up over thousands of years and that the stones give us only the faintest glimpse of. Let's talk now about the time when the Pictish world was at its height, because there is a period roughly from the late 7th century through to the early 9th century when the Pictish kingdom, or kingdoms, were among the most significant political forces in northern Britain, and when Pictish art was producing some of the most remarkable objects in the whole of early medieval Europe. This is the period that the stones represent most completely, and it ritualses what Cummings weris to Durapa. By the 7th century, the various Pictish kingdoms of the north had developed something approaching a unified political structure. Though the exact nature of that structure remains debated, there seem to have been a number of sub-kingdoms, each with its own ruler, but with a paramount king, sometimes described in the sources as Rex Pictorum, king of the Picts, who exercised some kind of overall authority. The extent and nature of that authority varied depending on the individual king. Strong kings like Bridair MacBilly, the victor of Nectansmere, exercised real power across most of Pictish territory. Weaker kings may have been little more than first among equals. The political geography of this period is complicated by the presence of multiple competing kingdoms in what is now Scotland and northern England. To the south, the Anglian kingdom of Northumbria was the main rival. To the west, the Irish kingdom of Delriata occupied what is now Argyll and continued to have political and cultural connections with Ireland across the narrow sea passage. To the southwest, various Brythonic kingdoms, speaking a Brittonic language related to Welsh, occupied what is now Strathclyde and parts of Cumbria. And the Picts were in constant interaction with all of these, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in alliance, occasionally in dynastic marriage. The dynastic marriages are interesting because they show the Picts operating at the level of sophisticated diplomacy, using kinship to build political relationships in exactly the same way that every other early medieval kingdom did. Pictish princesses appear in the genealogies of other kingdoms. Pictish kings have names that suggest connections to Irish or Brittonic dynasties. The supposedly isolated, supposedly primitive Picts were at the level of elite politics, playing the same game everyone else was playing, and playing it with some success, and they were producing art while they were doing it. The great Pictish symbol stones of the 7th, 8th and early 9th centuries are not provincial works. They are not the rough efforts of a culture just emerging from barbarism. They are sophisticated, assured expressions of a mature artistic tradition that knew what it was doing and did it with extraordinary skill. The carvers who made them had mastered the technical challenge of working in stone at a level that produced sharp, confident lines and detailed surface modeling. They had developed a repertoire of motifs, both the abstract symbols and the figurative animals, that they could vary and combine in ways that were clearly rule-governed, clearly meaningful, and clearly beautiful. The interlaced patterns that appear on the later Pictish stones, particularly on the cross slabs that combine Christian iconography with Pictish motifs, are technically complex and mathematically precise. Interlace, the continuous knotted patterns that form bands and borders and fill panels, requires the artist to plan the pattern before cutting it, to track multiple strands over and under each other across a large and complex composition, without losing count or making an error that would disrupt the overall structure. The Pictish interlace is as accomplished as anything produced by Irish or Northumbrian artists in the same period. And in some cases it goes further, combining interlace with animal form not work, and with the Pictish abstract symbols in composite compositions of breathtaking complexity. The famous St. Andrew's sarcophagus, found in the cathedral cemetery at St. Andrew's in Fife, and now housed in the nearby museum, is probably the finest single example of Pictish decorative art that survives. It's a large stone shrine or sarcophagus, probably made in the late 8th or early 9th century, and its surviving panels show a combination of biblical scenes, notably a scene that may depict David killing the lion, with figures that have been described as royal or divine, and with panels of Pictish animal ornament that display a control of three-dimensional form and of organic flowing line that would be remarkable in any period of European art. This is not the work of barbarians. This is the work of a culture at the peak of its artistic development, confident in its own traditions and technically accomplished enough to realize them at the highest level. And then it stops. The end of the Pictish kingdom is one of the genuine historical puzzles of early medieval Britain. Not because we don't know when it happened. Broadly speaking, we do. Not because we don't know who was involved. To some extent we do. But because we don't understand why it happened the way it did, or why the Pictish identity disappeared so completely and so quickly in its aftermath. The proximate cause of the end of the Pictish kingdom is usually identified as the union of the Pictish and Scottish Dalriata kingdoms in the 840s under a king called Syned MacAlpin, known in later Scottish tradition as Kenneth MacAlpin. According to the received narrative, Kenneth was a Dalriata king who managed to gain control of the Pictish kingdom either through conquest, through dynastic inheritance, or through some combination of both, and who created a unified kingdom that would eventually become Scotland. The Picts in this narrative were absorbed into the new kingdom, their distinctive identity, gradually merging into the broader Gaelic-influenced culture of what the sources start calling Alba. But this narrative has always had problems. The sources for Kenneth MacAlpin's career are late and contradictory. Some of them say he conquered the Picts by treachery, by inviting Pictish nobles to a feast, and by killing them, a story that bears suspicious resemblance to other treachery stories in early medieval literature and maybe literary rather than historical. Some say he had a legitimate claim to the Pictish throne through his mother. Some simply say he became king of the Picts without explaining how the actual process by which the Pictish kingdom ended and the kingdom of Alba began is at the level of historical detail, largely unknown. What we can say is that by the mid-9th century, Viking raiding and settlement was adding enormous pressure to all the kingdoms of northern Britain. The Norse had been raiding the coasts and islands of Scotland since at least the late 8th century, when the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD announced to the whole of northern Britain that the age of the Vikings had arrived. By the 830s and 840s, the Norse were not just raiding but settling, particularly in the northern and western Isles, in Orne and Shetland, and the outer Heads which had been solidly Pictish territory. The Norse presence in these islands effectively cut off the northernmost Pictish territories from the central Pictish kingdoms and may have made the consolidation of power, some kind of merger of the Pictish and Scottish kingdoms, a military and political necessity for survival. There is also a possible plague dimension. There were serious epidemic events in Britain and Ireland in the mid-9th century, and some scholars have suggested that a catastrophic loss of population in Pictish territory, particularly in the heartland areas where the symbol stone tradition was strongest, might help explain why the distinctive Pictish culture disappears so rapidly after the merger with Dalriata. If the people who maintained the Pictish cultural tradition, the craftspeople, the specialists, the memory keepers, were disproportionately killed in an epidemic event, then the tradition might have died with them far faster than it would have under any ordinary process of cultural change. This is speculative, but not without parallels elsewhere in history. What we can observe is the outcome. Within 2 or 3 generations of Kenneth MacAlpin's unification, the Pictish language had ceased to be used. The symbol stone tradition had ended. The distinctive Pictish artistic vocabulary that had been developing and flourishing for 5 centuries was gone, replaced by a Gaelic-influenced culture that identified itself as Scottish rather than Pictish. The king lists that the new kingdom maintained go back through the Pictish kings, treating them as predecessors in an unbroken royal line, but the Pictish identity itself is not claimed. It is instead consigned to history, to the category of things that were but are no more. How does this happen? How does a culture that had been asserting its identity through carved stone for 5 centuries, through monument making that required significant collective effort and commitment, simply stop? Even conquered peoples tend to maintain cultural markers. Even absorbed minorities tend to preserve fragments of their original language and practice. The completeness of the Pictish disappearance is strange by any standard. There are several theories. One is that the Pictish elite, the class of people who commissioned the stones and maintained the traditions, were specifically targeted in whatever political upheaval accompanied the unification. Kill the nobility, dispossess the specialist class, and the culture they maintained loses its patrons and its practitioners within a generation. Another theory is that the shift to Gaelic as the language of the new kingdom's elite was rapid and decisive, and that Pictish speakers who wanted to participate in the new political order had to abandon their language, and that linguistic shift carried cultural shift with it. A third possibility, not entirely incompatible with either of the others, is that Pictish identity had already been weakening before the formal unification, that the Viking pressure and the population losses of the early 9th century had already disrupted the social structures that maintained it, and that the merger of the kingdoms was less a conquering and more a filling of a vacuum that had already partly formed. What we are left with, in any case, is a mystery. The people who terrified Rome, who destroyed Northumbrian ambitions at Necton Mere, who produced the most enigmatic body of carved stone in early medieval Europe, who maintained a distinct identity through 5 centuries of enormous political and cultural pressure, vanished from history in a way that leaves almost no trace in the human record. The stones are there, the symbols are there, and we cannot read them, and the people who could read them are gone. But are they really gone? This is a question that turns out to be more complex than it initially appears, and it's a question that connects the Pictish story to some of the most interesting work in modern genetics. The genetic evidence from Scotland, and particularly from the northern and western parts of Wales, is not consistent with the story of complete population replacement. People don't just disappear. The descendants of the Picts did not all die. They married into the population of the new kingdom of Alba. They continued to farm the same fields their ancestors had farmed. They continued to fish the same waters. Their children grew up speaking Gaelic instead of Pictish, identifying as Scottish instead of Pictish, but they were biologically the same people. The Pictish genetic lineage is still in Scotland. It's still in the northeast, in Angus, in Aberdeenia, in the Moor Coast, in Orne and Shetland. It's diluted, mixed with Norse and later with Anglo-Man, and later still with the whole complex, modern, Scottish genetic pool. But it's there. What died was not the people. What died was the specific cultural package that made those people identifiably Pictish, the language, the symbol system, the particular artistic tradition, the specific religious practices, the memory structures. These things, unlike genes, cannot persist unless they are actively maintained, actively transmitted, actively practiced by living communities. When the social structures that did that maintenance and transmission were disrupted, the cultural package died, even though the biological descendants survived. This is one of the most important and most sobering lessons of the Pictish story. Cultures are fragile, in a way that populations are not. Populations are incredibly resilient, surviving catastrophes that kill most of their members, rebounding over generations. But the specific things that make a culture what it is, the specific meanings, the specific symbols, the specific ways of seeing and expressing and understanding the world. These are not stored anywhere except in the living practice of a community. When the community is disrupted beyond a certain point, the culture can die, even if the people don't. It's worth pausing here in this part of the story to think about what we have lost, not in a sentimental way, not just as an abstract historical tragedy, but specifically in terms of what was in that cultural package and what it might have contained. The Picts were, as I've argued, probably the end of a very long continuity of human presence in northern Britain. They were in some sense the last keepers of the oldest continuous human tradition in the island. They had been there in some form since before the first farmers arrived with their wheat and their cattle from the Near East 6,000 years ago, since before the builders of Stonehenge and the Ring of Brodgar, since before the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the first Celtic languages arrived. For those deep-time ancestors to have passed down anything to their Pictish descendants, anything of what they knew about the land, anything of what they understood about the sky and the animals and the plants and the seasons, it would have had to travel through an unbroken chain of transmission, parent to child, elder to apprentice, memory to memory across thousands of years. We know from analogous cases from indigenous cultures around the world, where very long oral traditions have been partially recovered, that it is possible for specific, detailed, accurate information to persist in oral tradition for astonishingly long periods. The Australian Aboriginal stories that remember coastlines flooded by rising seas 10,000 years ago. The Native American traditions that describe geological events with accuracy that can be independently confirmed. These traditions worked because the communities that held them were unbroken, because the social structures that transmitted them were maintained. If the Picts had been the inheritors of similarly deep traditions, those traditions were in the cultural package that died in the 9th and 10th centuries. And this is where the silence of the symbol stones becomes most painful. If those symbols could be decoded, if we could stand in front of the Hilton of Cadboll Stone, or the Abalno Cross, or the Maiden Stone, and read what was written there, we might be reading something that contained information accumulated over thousands of years of human experience in northern Britain, information about the land, about the animals, about the sky, about the ways that human communities had learned through painful trial and error over unimaginable stretches of time to survive and flourish in one of the most demanding environments in northern Europe. That information, if it was there, is locked in the symbols, and the symbols remain unread. There is, however, one dimension of Pictish legacy that has survived more completely than the rest, and it's one that doesn't get as much attention as it should. That dimension is place names. The landscape of Scotland is saturated with names that derive from Pictish, particularly element pit, from a Pictish word for a portion of land or an estate, Pitlock, Pitan, Pitry, Pitcapel. There are hundreds of these names scattered across the heartland of Pictish territory in Angus, Perthshire, Aberdeenshire, the Morth coastal area, and they are significant not just as linguistic fossils, interesting as those are, but because they represent a kind of cartographic memory. These are the names that the Picts put on the landscape, and those names stuck, surviving the transition from Pictish to Gaelic to Scots to English, surviving 1,000 years of political and cultural change because the communities living in those places kept using them. When you drive through Perth or Aberdeen today, and you pass through a village with a pit name, you are in a place that has a pish memory embedded in it. Not a dramatic memory, not a myth or a heroic story, just a name. But that name is a thread connecting the present to a world that ended more than 1,000 years ago. It is, in its quiet way, the most durable survival of the Pictish language. Not the symbols on the stones, not the texts that were never written, just the names on the map. The Picts also left their mark on the physical landscape in ways beyond the symbol stones. The Sutterins are one of the most intriguing of these material survivals. Sutterins are underground stone-lined passages built during the Iron Age and later that appear in large numbers in the Pictish heartland. Some of them are simple storage chambers, some are much more extensive, running for significant distances with chambers and side passages. Their function is debated. Food storage is the most common explanation, taking advantage of the constant cool temperature underground to preserve perishables. But some of them seem to be too elaborate for simple storage, and there are suggestions that they had other purposes: hiding places for people or valuables, ceremonial spaces, access routes to something we no longer understand. The Picts lived in these souterrains in the sense that they used them, and in some cases probably extended or modified earlier ones. They were part of the lived infrastructure of Pictish communities, part of the way those communities organized their relationship to the land. And while they don't carry symbols, while they don't speak the visual language that the stones speak, they are there underground, in the Pictish landscape, as a reminder that what we see on the surface is only part of what was there. Now, let's go further north and west, to the edge of the Pictish world, to the islands, because the islands are where some of the most interesting and some of the most puzzling Pictish evidence is found, and where the questions about deep continuity are most pressing. Orkney, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the most extraordinarily rich prehistoric landscapes in the world. By the time the Picts are using the islands, those Neolithic monuments are already 2,500 years old. But the Picts are not the first Iron Age people in Orkney. The Bruchs were built there, massive circular stone towers, some of them nearly 1,000 years before the Picts appear in the historical record. The people who built the Bruchs are not straightforwardly identifiable with the Picts, but they're part of the same broad cultural continuum of northern British peoples, and the Bruchs themselves continued to be used and modified into the Pictish period. What the Picts added to Orkney was their symbol tradition. There are Pictish symbol stones from Orne, some of them among the finest examples of the form. There is evidence of Pictish presence in the form of metalwork, of carved bone objects of the characteristic Pictish material culture. And then the Norse arrived in the 8th and 9th centuries, and Orkney became a Norse province, and the Pictish material culture disappears from the island record almost as completely as it disappears from the mainland. But not quite completely. There are hints, there are linguistic survivals in place, names that suggest some Pictish elements persisted in the islands even through the Norse period. There are traditions recorded much later that may preserve fragments of pre-Norse memory. And there is the evidence of the Orkney people themselves, whose genetic profile, even after centuries of Norse settlement and Norse dominance, retains markers of the older population that was there before the Norse. The relationship between the Picts and the Norse is an important and underexplored part of the story. The Norse who came to Orkney were not exactly the same as the Viking raiders who devastated Lindisfarne. The raiders and the settlers were often different groups, or the same groups at different phases of their activity. And the settlers who came to Orkney and Shetland and the northern mainland of Scotland were looking for land and community, not just plunder. Some of them probably married Pictish women. Some of them probably learned enough of the local language to manage the local land. The transition was violent in some respects and accommodating in others, and the resulting population of the Northern Isles in the early medieval period was a mixture. But the cultural dominance was Norse. The language that prevailed was Norn, the Old Norse-derived language that would be spoken in Vorn and Shetland until the 15th and 16th centuries, when Scots finally displaced it. The political and cultural frame was Norse, and in that context, the specifically Pictish elements, the symbols, the language, the artistic tradition, could not maintain themselves. They needed a Pictish political and social structure to exist within. Without that structure, they faded. Now, let's come back to the symbols one more time, because I want to think more carefully about what they might have been doing and why that matters. One of the most important observations about the Pictish symbol system is that it appears on multiple different types of objects and in multiple different contexts, but not randomly. The symbols appear on the large standing stones that are the most famous Pictish monuments. They appear on smaller portable stones. They appear on metalwork, on silver plaques, and on cave walls, and on bone objects. They appear in what seem to be ritual contexts, and in what seem to be administrative or commemorative context. The consistency of the symbols across these different media and contexts suggests that the system was broadly understood by at least a significant portion of Pictish society, not just by specialists. This is an important point because some theories about the symbols treat them as entirely diperic, as the private language of a priestly or specialist class. But if they appear on objects that functioned in everyday elite contexts, on objects that were displayed publicly and handled by many people, then the meaning of the symbols must have been at least partially accessible to the people who saw them. You don't put information in a format that nobody can read. You put information in a format that the intended audience can read. The intended audience for the symbol stones was clearly the Pictish community, or at least the Pictish elite. The stones were placed at specific locations along roads, at boundaries, in cemeteries, at places that already had significance in the landscape. They were meant to be seen by people passing through those places, by people who were using that landscape and who would encounter the stones in the course of their normal movements through Pictish territory. And the information the stones conveyed was presumably relevant to those people in those places. One of the most coherent theories about what the symbols mean is that they represent personal names or personal identifiers, that different symbols or combinations of symbols stood for specific individuals or families, and that the stones commemorate specific people in a way that Pictish society would have recognized immediately. In a culture with a matrilineal succession system, in which family identity and descent were absolutely critical to political power, a compact visual system for representing family identity would have been extremely useful. You could carve the symbol for a person's lineage or family onto stone, and everyone who saw it would know whose death was being marked, whose authority was being asserted, whose territory this was. This theory has been worked out in some detail by scholars, including Alex Wolff and others, who have looked at the distribution of specific symbols in relation to the known political geography of Pictish Scotland. The results are suggestive, but not conclusive. There are patterns that look like the distribution you'd come if specific symbols represented specific kindreds or territorial claims, but the patterns aren't clear enough, and the data isn't complete enough to be sure. Another theory not incompatible with the first is that the symbols encode a cosmological system, that they represent elements of the Pictish understanding of the world, and that the stones are not just commemorative but theological, making statements about the relationship between the dead and the cosmos, between the human world and whatever depicts understood to lie beyond it. The placement of the stones at locations with pre-existing sacred significance, the care with which certain symbols are combined, the fact that the same symbols appear in contexts that look ritual and in contexts that look administrative. All of this could be consistent with a system in which personal identity and cosmological identity were not sharply distinguished from each other. In many early medieval cultures, the name was not just a label. The name was a statement about the person's place in a larger order. Your name connected you to your ancestors, to your lineage, to the specific powers and obligations that lineage carried. In such a system, a visual representation of your name is also a visual representation of your cosmic position. A stone that marks your death by displaying your name symbol is also a stone that locates your death within a framework of meaning that goes beyond the individual. It places you in a lineage, in a territory, in a relationship with the powers that governed the world, as the Picts understood it. If the symbols work this way, and we can't be sure they do, then they are doing something that is at the same time simpler and more profound than writing in the conventional sense. They're not recording a verbal text, they're recording a position in a system of relationships. And that system of relationships is in the end what the Picts were protecting when they refused Rome, when they fought at Nectanmere, when they built their standing stones in the freezing northern landscape and carved into them symbols that they knew would outlast them, but whose meaning they could not have imagined would be lost within a few centuries. Let me now address the mystery that probably draws most people to the Picts in the first place, which is the sheer strangeness of their disappearance. Because however you explain it, however you distribute the causes between Viking pressure and plague and political absorption and cultural disruption, the speed and completeness of the Pictish disappearance is genuinely unusual, and it raises a question that historians are often reluctant to ask directly because it sounds too much like conspiracy theory. Was the disappearance of the Picts deliberately engineered? There are late medieval and early modern Scottish chronicles, written centuries after the events they describe, that contain stories about what happened to the Picts. These stories are not reliable historical sources in the technical sense. They were written long after the fact. They contradict each other in significant ways, and they are clearly shaped by the political and cultural purposes of the writers, rather than by any systematic attempt to preserve accurate historical memory. But they are persistent. They share certain common elements, and they are worth taking seriously as evidence of how later Scottish society understood the end of the Picts. Even if we can't treat them as straightforward history, the most dramatic of these stories involves Kenneth MacAlpin and a treachery that became known in later tradition as MacAlpin treason. The story says that Kenneth invited the Pictish nobility to a feast, a celebration of some kind of peace or alliance between the Scots and the Picts, and that during the feast, at a pre-arranged signal, the benches on which the Pictish nobles were sitting collapsed by hidden mechanisms, dropping them into hidden pits where they were killed by Scots waiting below. Or, in other versions, they were simply set upon and killed during the feast by Scots who had concealed weapons. The details vary. The core of the story, mass killing of the Pictish leadership at a feast, is consistent. This story is almost certainly not literally true in the specific form it takes in the chronicles. The practical logistics are absurd. The chronology is unclear, and as I noted, similar treachery feast stories appear in other, early medieval contexts, in ways that suggest this is a literary motif rather than a historical record. But something may lie behind it. The unusually rapid disappearance of the Pictish aristocratic class from the historical record after the Dalriadan unification is a real phenomenon that needs explaining. The fact that so little survived of Pictish culture, despite the fact that Pictish people clearly continued to live in Scotland, suggests that the specific social class responsible for commissioning and maintaining that culture was disrupted in a significant way. Whether that disruption took the form of mass killing, of political dispossession, of forced cultural replacement, or some combination of all three, we don't know, but the outcome is consistent with a process that was more violent and more intentional than a smooth dynastic merger. There are also stories in various Scottish and Irish sources about the deliberate destruction of Pictish records. These stories say that Kenneth or his successors systematically destroyed whatever written records or monuments existed that preserved Pictish identity. If this happened, it would explain a great deal about why we have so little to work with, but it's almost impossible to verify. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the absence of Pictish texts might equally well reflect the fact that Pictish culture was predominantly oral and material rather than literary, that there was never much to destroy. What the stories collectively suggest is that the people who came after the Picts, the people who built the Kingdom of Alba and eventually the Kingdom of Scotland, had reasons to minimize and marginalize Pictish memory. A new kingdom needed new foundations. It needed to present itself as a coherent entity with a clear identity. The Pictish past, with its different language and its different culture and its different political structures, might have seemed threatening to that project rather than useful to it. Better to absorb the Picts into the founding myth of Scotland as one of the predecessor peoples who were merged into the new kingdom than to maintain them as a distinct identity with distinct claims. This kind of deliberate cultural forgetting is not uncommon in history. It's not always conscious. Sometimes it happens through a 100 small decisions by a 100 different people, each making the choice that serves the present rather than preserving the past. But the cumulative effect can be as total as any deliberate destruction. And yet, the stones survived. This is perhaps the most telling detail of all. The Pictish symbol stone survived because stone survives, because they were too heavy to move easily, because they were embedded in the landscape in ways that made them part of places even after the culture that made them was gone. Some of them were eventually incorporated into Christian churches, turned face in to serve as building material, their symbols hidden and thus accidentally preserved. Some were tipped over and buried, and not found until farmers or road builders uncovered them, centuries or millennia later. Some stood in open fields and were weathered by centuries of Scottish rain, their finer details slowly dissolving, their bolder lines enduring. They survived as objects without context. They survived as evidence of something that had existed without enough information to tell us precisely what that something was. They survived as a question, as a mystery, as a challenge to anyone who looked at them and tried to understand what they meant and who made them and why. And they are still asking that question today in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, in the museum at Mel, in the stones still standing in the open air at places like Abalmno on the road through Angus. The Pictish symbol stones are there, waiting for someone to find the key that the Picts took with them when they went. I want to spend some time now on a specific set of objects that I think illuminates the Pictish world better than almost anything else, and that is the Pictish silver hoards. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, several significant hoards of Pictish silverwork were found in Scotland, most of them buried in the ground, probably in response to Viking raiding at moments when their owners needed to hide their most valuable possessions quickly. The most famous of these is the St. Ninians treasure found on the Shetland island of St. Ninians in 1958, when a schoolboy, excavating in the floor of a ruined chapel, unearthed a larchwood box containing 28 pieces of Pictish silver. The St. Ninians treasure is extraordinary. The 28 pieces include bowls, hanging bowls, a sword pommel, a cone-shaped object whose function is disputed, brooches, and a set of triangular objects that may be sword chaps. They date to around the late 8th century, and they are among the finest examples of Pictish metalwork that survive. The decorative vocabulary is the full Pictish repertoire: interlace, animal ornament, abstract symbols in some cases, all executed in silver with a technical mastery that the best modern silversmiths have examined with frank admiration. What the hoard tells us is that Pictish society in the 8th century included people with access to significant material wealth, people who commissioned luxury goods of high technical quality for their own use or as display, and people who valued those goods enough to bury them rather than let them fall into enemy hands. This is not a poor or marginal culture. This is a society operating at a level of material culture fully comparable with the other major kingdoms of early medieval Britain, with Northumbria, with Mercuria, with the Irish kingdoms. The Picts were not behind. They were fully participants in the economic and cultural networks of their period. But the hoard was never recovered by its owners. It was buried in the ground sometime in the late 8th or early 9th century, probably in the face of a Viking raid, and it stayed there. The people who buried it either died or were enslaved, or fled and never returned, or returned and aground, could not find it, and for 1200 years it lay under the floor of a chapel on a small island in Shetland, until a school boy's trowel found the edge of the box. That buried treasure in its way is a perfect emblem of the whole Pictish story. Something of extraordinary value hidden against a threat lying in darkness for centuries, eventually uncovered, but still not fully understood. The silver is there, the craft is visible, the intent, the specific human story that lies behind the burying of these objects by these specific hands in this specific ground is beyond recovery. Let's think about what has been claimed about the Picts over the years by people who are not archaeologists, because this is also part of the story of how the Picts have been remembered and misremembered. In the popular imagination and in certain strands of alternative history, the Picts have been connected to a remarkable array of theories. They have been identified as the original inhabitants of Scotland with a direct, unbroken line to the prehistoric peoples who built Stonehenge, which is actually partially reasonable, in the sense that there is probably some genetic continuity. They have been connected to the mysterious Atlantis tradition because some people have noted that Plato's description of Atlantis includes elements that parallel aspects of prehistoric, Atlantic European culture. They have been described as a lost civilization whose knowledge, including astronomical and mathematical knowledge embedded in the stone monuments, was superior to anything that followed them. Some of these claims are more responsible than others. The idea of a genetic continuity between the Neolithic monument builders and the Picts is not fringe theory. It's supported by genetic evidence. Even if the precise nature and degree of that continuity is still being worked out, the idea that the stone monuments of northern Britain from the Neolithic period through to the Pictish symbol stones represent a tradition of monument making that spans thousands of years and encodes sophisticated knowledge about the landscape and the sky. This is not fringe theory either. It's a reasonable interpretation of the evidence. But the leap from that to claims about lost advanced technology or about the Picts having connections to Atlantis or to extraterrestrial influence, these are claims that go far beyond what the evidence supports and that tend to distract from the genuine and sufficiently remarkable story. The real Pish story doesn't need any of this. It is strange enough on its own terms, a people who may be the last expression of a prehistoric deep population, who developed one, the most complex and still undecoded visual symbol systems in European history, who terrorized the greatest military power of the ancient world, who produced extraordinary art at the peak of their civilization, and who then vanished with the completeness that remains after all the scholarly attention that has been paid to them, fundamentally unexplained. This is strange enough. This is more than strange enough. What the alternative history tradition does get right, even if it gets the specifics wrong, is the instinct that the Pictish story is not a minor footnote. It is not just one more entry in the catalogue of early medieval kingdoms, appearing and disappearing like dozens of others. There is something about the Picts that resonates at a deeper level, something that the symbol stones communicate even when we can't read them, something about the depth of time they represent and the depth of what was lost when they disappeared. And that resonance is, I think, part of why the Picts keep coming back. They keep appearing in popular culture, in historical novels, in alternative histories, in documentaries. They keep being reinvented, reinterpreted, claimed by various traditions as evidence for various theories. Because the emptiness at the center of the Pictish story, the silence where their own voice should be, invites projection. We fill the silence with what we need to put there. Sometimes that's harmless. Sometimes it obscures the real question, which is stranger and more interesting than any answer we've projected onto it. Let me now take the story in a slightly different direction, towards something that I think connects the Pictish world to a broader story about human knowledge and human memory. One of the things that fascinates me most about the symbol stones is not just what's on them, it's where they are. The Pictish symbol stones are distributed across the landscape of northern Scotland, in patterns that tell us something about how the Picts organized their world. They're found along rivers, particularly at fords, the places where the rivers could be crossed. They're found at boundary points between territories. They're found at places that were already sacred or significant before the Picts put their stones there, places with older monuments, places that commanded views of significant stretches of landscape. They're found in cemeteries where the dead were buried, making the connection between the symbolism on the stones and the people commemorated by those stones explicit. This distribution tells us that the Picts were using their symbol language not just to record information, but to claim space. Each stone placed at a ford, or a boundary, or a cemetery was a marker, a statement. This place belongs to the people who made this mark. This place is within the territory of this kindred, this lineage, this set of relationships represented by this combination of symbols. The stones were an inscription of the Pictish world onto the physical landscape, a way of making the landscape speak a human language. and the language it spoke was the symbol language, not Pictish words, but Pictish signs. This distinction matters. A word-based inscription says things in the language of the people who made it, and requires knowledge of that language to decode. A symbol-based inscription operates differently. The symbols can be read by anyone who knows the code, regardless of what language they speak, regardless of whether the Pictish spoken language would have been comprehensible to them. In a world where different linguistic groups were constantly in contact, where Irish speakers and Brittonic speakers and Anglian speakers were all crossing into Pictish territory for various purposes, a visual symbol system that worked independently of spoken language would have had practical advantages. It could communicate to people who couldn't understand Pictish speech. It could make claims and convey information across linguistic boundaries. Whether this was deliberate, whether the Picts consciously developed their symbol system partly because of its language-independent quality, we can't know. But the effect is real, and it may help explain why the symbols could persist in contexts like the later Christian monument tradition, where the spoken language context was changing. The symbols were not dependent on the spoken language. They had their own separate system of meaning. And even when Pictish as a spoken language began to fade, the symbol system could continue because it was operating on a different track. This is actually quite sophisticated thinking about communication, whether the Picts were doing it deliberately or not. In a world of multiple languages and constant political change, creating a communication system that works independently of any specific spoken language is a remarkable achievement, and the persistence of the symbol system through the changes of the 8th and 9th centuries, its continued use, even as the political and linguistic context was shifting dramatically, may reflect the fact that it was genuinely useful in ways that a purely verbal system would not have been. There's one more aspect of the Pictish world that I want to address before we come to a conclusion, and that's the question of Pictish women. I mentioned earlier the matrinal succession system and the images of powerful women on the sharp symbol stones, but I want to go further because I think the role of women in Pictish society was probably significantly different from their role in the other societies of early medieval Britain, and that this difference is part of what made the Picts distinctive. The matrilineal succession system is the most obvious indicator of this difference, but it's not the only one. The appearance of women as significant figures on the symbol stones, the mirror and comb symbols that may be associated specifically with female identity, the accounts in later sources of Pictish women playing active roles in political and even military affairs. All of these point toward a society in which women, at least women of the elite class, had a level of public agency and recognized significance that was unusual in the context of the early medieval world. This may be another inheritance from the deep past. Some of the most ancient evidence of symbolic behavior in Europe, including the earliest personal ornaments, the earliest evidence of ochre use for body decoration, shows women as participants in these activities from the beginning. The Venus figurines of the European Upper Paleolithic, whatever exactly they represent, suggest that female bodies were the objects of intense symbolic attention from the very earliest period of elaborate symbolic behavior. The later Neolithic monument traditions, including the traditions that built the monuments of Orne and elsewhere in northern Britain, seem from burial evidence to have included significant female figures, women buried with grave goods that suggest high status and social importance. If there is some continuity between these very deep traditions and the Pictish culture of the early medieval period, it's possible that the relatively elevated status of women in Pictish society reflects a very ancient inheritance, a set of social structures that had been maintained with modifications from a period in which female authority was differently organized than it became in the Iron Age and early medieval world, dominated by warrior aristocracies and their male-oriented values. The Picts may have preserved in their matrinal succession and in their apparent acknowledgement of female authority something from a much older way of organizing society that had been overlaid or replaced elsewhere. This is highly speculative, and I want to be clear about that. But it's speculation that is grounded in the evidence, and it raises a question worth asking. What if the Pictish world in its social organization, as much as in its art and its language, was the end of a very long thread that connected it to the world before the Celtic migrations, before the Pictish, Indo-European languages, before the warrior culture and the patrilineal descent systems that those languages and those cultures brought with them. What if the Pictish were, in a very specific sense, the last culture in Britain that still organized itself according to structures inherited from a world so old that we have almost no direct knowledge of it? We can't prove this. We might never be able to prove it. But the pattern of evidence taken as a whole points in this direction. The genetic distinctiveness, the linguistic isolation. Pictish was apparently not closely related to the Brittonic languages of southern Britain or to the Goidelic languages of Ireland, suggesting it had been developing in isolation for a very long time. The symbol system, with no known parallels anywhere else. The matrilineal succession, the persistent connections to the prehistoric monuments. All of these things are consistent with a culture that is genuinely old, in a way that the other cultures of early medieval Britain were not. And the loss of that culture is therefore not just the loss of one more early medieval kingdom. It is potentially the loss of the last living connection to something that was forming in Britain before the Bronze Age, before the arrival of the peoples and languages and social structures that shaped everything we know about British history. The Picts were not just another kingdom, they were a window onto a world that predated the world we know. And when that window closed, it closed permanently. The stones remain, 200 pieces of carved rock scattered across the landscape of northern Scotland, each one a fragment of a system we don't understand, each one covered in symbols we can see but cannot read. They are among the most haunting objects in European archaeology, not because they are dramatic, although some of them are extremely beautiful, but because they are so precisely, so deliberately there, so clearly made by people who knew exactly what they were doing and what they meant, and so completely silent on all the questions we most want to ask. What did you believe? What did you fear? What did you love? What were the stories you told about these symbols? About the animals? About the crescent and the V-rod and the double disc? What were the names of the people you commemorated? What language did you dream in? What did you call the sea, the mountains, the wind, the particular quality of light on a Scottish winter afternoon when the sky goes pale gold and the frost lies in the shadows of the hills? What did it feel like to be you, living in that specific place, in that specific time, with all of this behind you? All this depth of human presence in the landscape, and all of this being asked of you to maintain it, to carry it forward, to add your mark to the long record before handing it to whoever came next. The Picts left the stones survived, the meaning didn't survive with them, and that gap between the fact of the stones and the silence of their meaning is the wound at the center of British prehistory that all the scholarship and all the theory can describe, but cannot heal. In the end, the story of the Picts is a story about what it means to be forgotten. Not lost entirely, not destroyed without trace, but forgotten in the specific, final sense. That the things that made you what you were are no longer accessible to anyone. Not even your own descendants to your descendants are there. Your DNA is in their bodies. Your place names are on their maps. The land you farmed and the symbols you carved are still present in the physical world, but the meaning is gone. The context is gone. The living thread that connected all of it to a coherent human world is gone. Cut sometime in the 9th or 10th century by a combination of forces that nobody fully directed and nobody fully understood. The Picts terrified Rome because they were old in a way Rome couldn't comprehend. They had been in that landscape since before there was a Rome. They had been there since before there was a Mediterranean civilization. They had been there in some form since the island emerged from the ice. And that depth of presence was itself a kind of power. The power of an unbroken connection to a place that goes so deep it becomes something else. Becomes something that looks from the outside like obstinacy or savagery or magic, but is actually just the accumulated weight of being somewhere for a very, very long time, and then they were gone, or nearly gone, or gone in the specific sense that matters, and the Romans who built a wall to keep them out are also gone, and the Vikings who pushed them from the islands are gone, and the Scottish kingdom that absorbed them is technically still there, but has been transformed so many times that it would not be recognizable to Kenneth MacSelpin. Everything is gone. Everything changes. Only the stones remain, standing in the rain on a Scottish hillside, covered in symbols nobody can read, still asking the question that the Picts apparently wanted, to ask loudly enough to carve it into granite, still waiting for an answer that has not yet come. What were they saying? We may never know, but they were saying something. They carved it in stone so that it would last, so that someone someday standing in that rain on that hillside would stop and look, and understand that there had been a people here, a people with a language and a vision and a way of seeing the world that was entirely their own. A people who had survived everything that history threw at them for longer than most of the civilizations we know about even lasted. A people who in the end could not survive everything, but who left the stones. And the stones are still there, and the symbols are still unread, and the mystery is still alive. There is one final thing I want to say about the Picts, and it's something that only becomes clear when you step back from the history, and the archaeology, and the theories, and look at the whole shape of the story from the beginning. The Picts did not fail. They were not defeated in any final decisive sense. Rome did not conquer them. The Northumbrians did not conquer them. The Vikings did not conquer them. The end of the Pictish kingdom was a complex, contested, partially internal, partially externally driven transformation that we don't fully understand. But at no point from the first Roman incursions in the 1st century AD to the political absorption of the 9th century was there a moment where an external force simply overwhelmed them and erased them. What happened to the Picts was slower and stranger than defeat. It was something more like dissolution. The political structures that held the culture together were disrupted. The social class that maintained the cultural traditions was destroyed or dispersed, or simply stopped reproducing itself. The language ceased to be transmitted to children. The symbol system ceased to be used, and without the living practice of a culture, the culture is gone, even if the people are still there. This is worth thinking about in a world that still contains right now cultures under exactly the same kind of pressure. Not the same specific pressures, not the same specific external forces, but the same general dynamic, the disruption of the social structures that hold a culture together, the displacement of the specialist class that maintains it, the cessation of the transmission, from parent to child, of the specific things that make a culture what it is. This is happening right now to languages and traditions and ways of seeing the world that will be gone within a generation if current trends continue. And the Pictish story is, among other things, a warning about how quickly and how completely that loss can happen. The Picts had been in the landscape for thousands of years when the events of the 9th century disrupted their culture. Thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, of artistic tradition, of language, of ways, of understanding the world, and within a few generations it was gone. Not all of it, not the genes, not the place names, not the stones, but the essential thing, the living practice, the transmitted meaning, was gone. The symbols on the stones are still there. They will still be there long after everything we are building now has crumbled. Stone is patient in a way that human cultures are not. The symbols will wait. They have been waiting for 1200 years already. They will wait, and somewhere, sometime, someone may find the key, may find the connection that unlocks the meaning. The Pictish Rosetta Stone that nobody has found yet. Some bilingual text in a place that hasn't been excavated. Some insight about the structure of the symbol system that nobody has yet had. The history of decipherment gives reason for cautious hope. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, was undeciphered for decades before Michael Ventris cracked it in 1952. The Mayan glyphs were considered undecipherable until a series of breakthroughs in the late 20th century opened them up. Mysteries that seem permanent sometimes yield. If the Pictish symbols are ever decoded, The result will be one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of archaeology. We will hear a voice that has been silent for 12,200 years. We will hear what the people who built those stones wanted to say, what they thought was important enough to carve in granite, what they wanted to last. We will hear the Picts speaking in their own language for the first time. Until that day, the stones stand in the Scottish rain. The symbols wait in the silence. And the Picts, who terrified every civilization that came to Britain, who refused Rome and broke Northumbria, and maintained their strange and beautiful and deeply mysterious culture for 5 centuries of the Christian era, and God knows how many centuries before it, remain just beyond the reach of our understanding, present and absent at the same time, there and not there, waiting to be read. They built their monuments to lust. They did last. The message is there in the stone, in the symbols, in the deliberate and extraordinary care with which they were made. We just can't hear it yet, but we're still listening. There is a silence in the historical record that most people never notice, and the Picts inhabit it completely. Go to a library, find the thickest, most comprehensive history of Britain you can locate, and look at the index. You will find the Picts there somewhere between pages on the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, occupying a paragraph or two, maybe half a page if you're lucky. The paragraph will say something about tattooed warriors, about Hadrian's wall, about Kenneth MacAlpin, and then it will move on because the main narrative has more important things to attend to. The Picts are a footnote in the story of Britain. They are the thing that was there before the thing that matters, the obstacle that had to be managed, and before the real history could begin. This is profoundly wrong, and understanding why it is wrong is, I think, one of the most important things you can take away from spending time with the Pictish story. The Picts are not a footnote. They are not a prelude. They are not a barbarian absence that civilization filled. They are a civilization, a specific, complex, long-lasting, sophisticated civilization, developed in a specific place, over a very long time, and that expressed itself in ways that are still incompletely understood. The reason they appear as a footnote is not because they were minor, it's because they left almost no texts. The history we tell is primarily a history that texts can tell. Think about what it means to live in a world shaped entirely by the literate tradition. The history we know, the history that gets written down and taught and passed on, is the history of the people who wrote things down. The further back you go, the more completely the record is dominated by literate civilizations. Rome, Greece, the Near Eastern empires, medieval Christendom, the people who interacted with these civilizations but who did not themselves produce texts, appear in the record only through the lens of those literate cultures. They appear as the other, as the enemy, as the barbarian, as the problem to be solved. Their own perspective is absent, not because they had no perspective, but because they didn't commit it to the written medium that survives. The Picts chose a different medium, stone, and stone survives differently than text. It survives physically, as objects in a landscape, but it doesn't survive semantically. It doesn't retain its meaning in the way that a text can retain its meaning even to a reader, separated from the author by 1,000 years. A Latin sentence written in the 4th century can still be read by someone who has learned Latin today. A Pictish symbol carved in the 4th century cannot be read by anyone today because the code died with the people who knew it. The physical object persists. The meaning doesn't. This asymmetry between the physical durability of stone and the semantic fragility of the code, needed to read it, is one of the great tragic ironies of the Pictish legacy. The Picts may have chosen stone precisely because they wanted their statements to last, and the statements did last, but they lasted as mute objects rather than as living communication. The medium that was chosen for its permanence became, in the most important sense, impermanent, because what can't be read is, in a functional sense, not there. Let me take you to a specific place in the Pictish landscape, because I think specific places tell the story better than any general account can. The village of Abernoe in Angus, about 5 miles from the town of Forfar, stands at the edge of the Sidor, hills on the northern fringes of the Angus agricultural heartland. It is an ordinary Scottish agricultural village in most respects, the kind of place that you would drive through without noticing if you were not specifically looking for it. But in and around Abel Knowe, there are 4 Pictish symbol stones, and together they constitute one of the most important groups of Pictish monuments anywhere in Scotland. The most famous of the Abel Knowe stones, usually called the Abel Knowe churchyard stone, stands in the churchyard of the village church. It is a large cross slab, one of the class Boo stones with a magnificent cross on one face and an extraordinarily detailed battle scene on the other. The battle scene is generally believed to represent the Battle of Nectan's Mar in 685. The battle I described earlier, in which the Pictish king Brid MacBilly destroyed the North Umbrian army of Excit. The scene shows cavalry and infantry in combat, with fallen warriors and a crow that may represent death or the aftermath of battle, and it captures the chaos and violence of early medieval combat with an immediacy that is startling. Look at this stone long enough, and you begin to understand something about how the Picts used their medium. The cross on one face is a statement about religion, about the Pictish accommodation with Christianity, about the theological framework within which the Picts of the 8th century understood their world. The battle scene on the other face is a statement about history, about a specific military event that was important enough to commemorate in permanent stone. The combination is not contradictory. It is complete. It says, "We are a Christian people, and this is what we did, and the God we serve was present when we did it." But what it says in the symbol system at the bottom of the stone, what the specific symbols carved there mean in relation to the cross and the battle scene, we don't know. Maybe they name the person who commissioned the stone. Maybe they identify the battle or the king. Maybe they make a theological statement that the cross alone doesn't capture. The stone is speaking loudly and clearly on 2 of its registers in a language we can read, and on the 3rd register, in the language we can't, it's saying something we can't hear. The road through Aberlimno also has 3 more stones standing in a row in a grassy verge by the side of the main road. These are Class 1 stones, the earlier type, without crosses, bearing only the abstract symbols and animal designs. The symbols on these stones are among the finest examples of their type: a serpent, a double disc and zerod, a mirror and comb on one stone, a fish on another, a horseman on a third. Each stone was placed here deliberately at some point in the period between roughly the 5th and 7th centuries by people who knew what they were doing and why. The location, a roadside site in the heart of Pictish agricultural territory, suggests these were meant to be seen. They were communication in a public space. They were saying something to everyone who passed. What were they saying? We don't know. I've been dwelling on what we don't know, and I want to be clear that this is not just an absence of information. It's a specific kind of presence. The not knowing about the Picts is itself a historically meaningful fact. It tells us something about how they chose to exist in the world, about what they prioritized and what they didn't, about what mattered to them and what didn't. A culture that leaves texts behind is a culture that valued the verbal record. A culture that leaves carved stones behind is a culture that valued the permanent visual statement. A culture that apparently leaves almost nothing behind in terms of institutional records or administrative documents is a culture that organized itself differently from the literate, administrative empires around it. The Picts were not trying to be Rome. They were not trying to be Ireland. They were not trying to be Northumbria. They were trying to be the Picts, and the Pictish way of being in the world involved visual communication rather than verbal, monumental communication rather than archival, permanent marks on the landscape rather than records in libraries. This is a coherent approach to the problem of how to persist in the world, how to leave your mark, how to say who you are. It's just different from the approach that produces texts. And because our understanding of the past is filtered primarily through texts, the Pictish approach leaves us less to work with. This is one of the reasons why archaeology matters in a way that goes beyond the recovery of objects. Archaeology is one of the few disciplines that can partially compensate for the bias of the textual record that can recover information about cultures that didn't write, or whose writing has been lost, or whose writing is in a system we can't yet read. The Pictish symbol stones have been studied archaeologically for generations, and what archaeology has told us, combined with what the historical sources can contribute, gives us a picture that, while incomplete, is genuinely richer than it would have been from text alone. We know from archaeology where the Picts lived. We know the kinds of settlements they built, the round houses and the enclosed farmsteads, and the hill forts that dot the landscape of northern Scotland. We know from the animal bones found in those settlements what they ate. They kept cattle and sheep and pigs. They hunted deer and wild boar. They fished the rivers and the sea. They grew grain. Their diet was varied, and by the standards of early medieval Europe, reasonably good. There is nothing in the archaeological record of Pictish settlements that suggests a society living on the edge of subsistence. This was a functioning agricultural society, with adequate food supplies, and the time and resources to invest in things beyond simple survival. We know from the metalwork finds that the Picts participated in the networks of trade and exchange that connected early medieval Britain and Ireland. The silver hoards contain objects that reflect knowledge of metalworking techniques used in Ireland and Northumbria, sometimes pieces that might have been acquired through trade or gift exchange, sometimes pieces that are distinctively Pictish interpretations of wider early medieval styles. The Picts were not isolated. They were in contact with the wider world of early medieval Europe, and their art reflects that contact while remaining distinctively their own. We know from the distribution of different types of Pictish monuments and objects something about the political geography of the Pictish kingdoms. The densest concentration of symbol stones is in the northeastern coastal zone in Angus and Sardinia, and it is here that the most complex and accomplished examples of the art form are found. This suggests that the heartland of Pictish power and culture was in this zone, and that the peripheral areas, the far north, the islands, the western fringes, participated in the broader Pictish cultural tradition at a remove from the center. We know from the evidence of Pictish burials that the dead were treated with care and with apparent significance. Some Pictish burials contain grave goods, including jewelry and personal ornaments that indicate the dead person's status and identity were considered important enough to mark in death. Other Pictish burials are in what appear to be communal cemeteries associated with specific settlements or territories, suggesting that the management of the dead was a community concern tied to the land, in the same way that the symbol stones were tied to specific places in the landscape. What we don't know from archaeology or from any other source is what it felt like to be Pictish, what the inside of a Pictish life was like, what a Pictish child was taught, what a Pictish elder remembered, what a Pictish craftsperson thought about as they worked the stone or the silver, what a Pictish warrior prayed, if that's the right word, before battle, what a Pictish woman felt when she looked at the symbol stones that marked her lineage and her territory. These are the things that texts can sometimes give us fragmentarily and imperfectly, and that other sources cannot give us at all. The nearest we get to the inner Pish life, in my view, is through the animals on the symbol stones. The figurative animals, particularly the animals in motion, the galloping horses, and the swimming fish, and the prowling big cats, and the soaring eagles. These are the work of people who had looked very carefully at the specific way that specific animals moved and held themselves, and who cared about getting it right. The swimming creature, the Pictish beast, whatever it represents, is not a generic water monster. It has a specific consistent form with specific features that its makers reproduced across hundreds of stones over hundreds of years. Whether it was a real animal that the Picts saw or a mythological creature that they imagined, with consistent clarity, it was important to them. They needed it to look right. That need for correctness, that care about accurately representing the thing you were representing, tells you something about the Pictish way of seeing. They were paying attention to the world. They were observing carefully. They had strong views about what things looked like, and they were capable of rendering what they saw with great skill. The artistic tradition that produced the symbol stones was built on observation as much as on convention, and the combination of careful observation and consistent symbolic vocabulary is what gives Pictish art its distinctive quality. The sense that the people who made it were both deeply familiar with the visual world and deeply committed to a specific way of representing it. This is not the art of people who were not thinking. This is the art of people who were thinking in a specific, sophisticated, visually sophisticated way that left its record in stone. And whatever else was in their heads, whatever the language and the stories and the beliefs and the fears and the joys that filled out the Pictish inner world, that visual intelligence was central to it. The symbols are not accidents. The animals are not accidents. The extraordinary compositional sophistication of the great class stones is not an accident. It is the product of a tradition of careful, sustained, disciplined attention to the visual world that was maintained over centuries by a culture that valued it. And when that culture ended, that specific tradition of visual attention and visual expression ended with it. The Scottish artistic tradition that followed the Picts was continuous with the broader, Gaelic-Irish tradition, which was beautiful in its own right but different. The things the Picts were doing with the animal forms, the specific way they rendered movement and mass, and the inner energy of living creatures, those things did not survive the transition. They were part of the package that was lost. Let me return once more to the question of what the Picts meant to the people who came after them, because this is an interesting and underexplored aspect of the history. The kingdom of Alba, which was the successor to the merged Pictish and Delridan kingdoms, did maintain a memory of the Picts, but it was a managed memory. The king lists of Alba included the Pictish kings as predecessors in a continuous royal line, which served the political purpose of legitimizing the new kingdom's claim to rule over the territory of the old Pictish kingdoms. The Picts were useful as ancestors for the new kingdom's royal family. They were less useful as a living alternative identity, as a population with its own distinct culture and its own claims separate from the new kingdom's less claims. So the Pictish past was selectively preserved. The royal genealogies were maintained because they were politically necessary. Everything else was allowed to fade. The stories, the language, the specific cultural practices that made the Picts recognizably themselves. These were not maintained because they didn't serve the new political order. They were the cultural property of the old order, and the new order had no use for them. This is a pattern that has repeated itself many times in history. New political entities routinely manage the memory of the cultures they supersede, preserving what is useful for their own legitimacy and allowing the rest to die. The Roman Empire did it. The Norman conquest did it. Empires and kingdoms in every part of the world have done it. The specifics vary, but the dynamic is consistent. The successor culture inherits the territory, and the population of the predecessor culture selects from the predecessor's legacy the elements that can be appropriated in support of the new order, and discards the rest. What was different about the Pictish case was the speed and the completeness of the cultural loss. We are talking about a culture that had been the dominant political and cultural force in northern Britain for at least 5 centuries, and that had deep roots going back much further, being reduced within 2 or 3 generations to a historical memory without living practice. That's fast. That's faster than most comparable historical examples of cultural transformation, and it suggests that something specific happened, something more targeted and more disruptive than simple political change that accelerated the loss beyond what would normally occur. I've mentioned the theories: deliberate killing of the elite class, systematic destruction of cultural materials, epidemic loss of the specialist class. All of these are plausible, and none is definitively confirmed. But there is one more possibility that I think deserves consideration, which is the nature of the Pictish cultural tradition itself. If the tradition was primarily oral, if the key knowledge was held in trained human memories, rather than written on materials that could be copied and distributed, then the disruption of the specific social structures that produced and maintained those trained memories would have caused an irreversible loss very quickly. You can reconstruct a text if you have copies of it scattered in different locations. You cannot reconstruct a memory tradition once the people who held it are dead or dispersed. The oral tradition of a culture is in this sense more fragile than its literary tradition, even though it is often much older. The bards and the memory specialists of early Irish culture were producing written texts by the early medieval period, embedding their oral traditions in manuscript form, and creating a body of literature that was resilient to the loss of individual practitioners because it was distributed across multiple physical copies. The Welsh poetic tradition similarly began committing itself to writing, preserving its content in a medium that could survive the death or displacement of the practitioners. If the Picts had a comparable tradition of specialized memory keepers and did not make the transition to textual preservation of that tradition, then the disruption of the social structures that supported those memory keepers would have been catastrophic in a way that no comparable event in the Irish or Welsh traditions would have been. This may be the final, most complete explanation for the silence at the center of the Pictish record. Not that the Picts didn't have knowledge worth preserving, not that they didn't value memory and tradition, but that the specific form in which they preserved those things, the human memory, the oral transmission, the trained specialist, was precisely the form most vulnerable to the disruptions of the 9th century. When the specialist class was disrupted, the tradition died, and it died quickly, because there were no texts to survive as backup copies, no written literature to preserve the content after the practitioners were gone. If this is right, then the symbol stones are doubly poignant. They were made to last. They were carved in the hardest medium available, precisely because their makers understood that memory is fragile, and stone is not. They were the attempt to create a backup, to inscribe in the landscape information that might otherwise exist only in human minds. They were in a very real sense the Pictish response to exactly the vulnerability I've been describing. And they worked in the sense that they're still there, but they didn't work fully because the code for reading them was stored in exactly the human memory tradition that didn't survive. And without the code, the stones are permanent, but silent. There are people alive today who are working to change this situation. Scholars at universities in Scotland and elsewhere are applying new methods to the Pictish symbol problem, methods that combine archaeology, linguistics, statistics, and digital humanities in ways that would have been impossible a generation ago. They are building comprehensive databases of all known Pish symbols and their contexts. They are applying machine learning techniques that can detect patterns in large datasets, looking for structural regularities that might reveal the underlying logic of the system. They are studying languages known to be related to Pictish, particularly the Brythonic, languages looking for linguistic clues about what the symbols might represent. They are using isotope analysis and ancient DNA to learn more about who the people were, where they came from, what their social structures looked like. None of this has yet produced a decipherment. None of it may ever produce a complete decipherment. But the work is ongoing, and the tools are getting better, and the community of people who care deeply about this problem is larger and more capable than it has ever been. The Pictish symbols are not giving up their secrets easily. They have been keeping it for 1200 years, but they are being subjected to scrutiny that their makers could not have imagined. And every piece of new information, every new pattern detected, every new connection made between the symbols and the broader cultural context in which they existed, brings the decipherment, however incrementally, a little closer. Meanwhile, the stones stand in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, where some of the finest examples have been gathered for protection and study. In the smaller specialist museum at Mel, in Perthshire, which houses one of the largest collections of Pictish stones in the world, stones found in and around the village churchyard that may mark a significant Pictish cemetery or ritual site in the open air at Abalmno and at many other locations across the Pictish heartland, where the stones stand in the same landscape where they were placed 1200 or more years ago, wearing the Scottish weather, gradually losing detail on their exposed faces, but still present, still there, still asking, I have been to some of these places. I have stood in front of specific stones and looked at the symbols and felt the particular quality of that not knowing, the sense of being in the presence of something that is clearly trying to communicate, that was made with enormous care, specifically to communicate, and being unable to receive the communication. It is an unusual experience. It is not quite like looking at abstract art, where the absence of specific reference is in some sense the point. It is more like looking at a face whose expression you cannot read, whose language you don't speak, who is looking directly at you and saying something that matters, something that was important enough to be carved in granite, something that has been waiting to be understood for 12 centuries. The Picts made these stones so that you would look at them. They made them so that whoever came after, however far in the future, would see that someone had been here, had cared about something enough to commit it permanently to stone. The gift they gave to the future was the permanence of the statement. The tragedy is that the meaning of the statement didn't travel with the stone. Only the form survived. The content is gone, but not completely gone. The animals are there. The Pictish beast, whatever it was, keeps swimming through the stone. The horses keep galloping. The birds keep soaring. The humans keep standing, fighting, riding, hunting in scenes that communicate something about Pictish life, even without the code that would tell us exactly what they mean. The crosses on the later stones speak a language we can read, the language of early medieval Christian art, and through them we know something about how the Picts related to the Christianity they adopted, what they chose to combine it with, how they made it their own. And the abstract symbols, the crescent and the V-rod and the double disc and the rest, they are there too, waiting, not making themselves available yet, but they're permanent, patient, carved in stone by hands that knew what they were doing, that had a purpose, that wanted to say something that mattered. Those hands are gone. That purpose in its specific content is gone, but the desire to communicate, the faith that communication is possible and worthwhile, the commitment to making something that will outlast the maker and speak to whoever comes next, that is still there, carved into the stone, as present as the symbols themselves. The Picts are gone, the symbols remain, and we are still learning to listen. There is in the northeastern corner of Scotland a stretch of coastline where the stone beach runs out to a headland, and the North Sea is all horizon, and the wind comes off the water with a specific quality that carries all the distances it has travelled. Stand there on a clear autumn evening, when the light is going gold, and the air is sharp with salt, and cold, and the landscape feels impossibly old. Not old in the tourist brochure sense, the picturesque old of castle ruins and battlefield signs. Old in a way that has nothing to do with human narrative. Old in the geological sense, in the sense that the rocks under your feet were laid down before there were complex animals, and that the sea in front of you has been here, in something like its present form, for longer than the human species has existed. The Picts knew this coast. They fished it and watched it and built their symbol stones near it. The symbols they made in this landscape are still here, moved off the headlands and the cliff edges where some of them originally stood, and into the protection of museums, but present in the record, present in the accumulated scholarship that has tried to understand them. The people are gone. The symbols are in museums. The coast is unchanged. This is what deep time feels like, when you stop trying to fill it with narrative and just let it be what it is. Not empty, not meaningless, not a blank to be filled with theories and projections, just very, very old and indifferent to our attempts to understand it, and full, in its silence, of everything that has ever happened here. The Picts were part of this landscape in a way that is different from being a political entity or a cultural tradition. They were physically part of it. Their bones in the ground, their genes in the modern population, their place names on the map. They were woven into the landscape of northern Scotland in the way that everything that has ever lived in a place is woven into it invisibly, permanently, beyond the reach of any political transformation. You cannot decimate a people from their landscape completely. The landscape holds them, the way it holds the fossil record, the way it holds the pollen record, the way it holds the genetic record in the modern population's DNA. The symbol stones are the visible tip of that deep presence. They're the part that chose permanence, that said, I was here and I meant something. But under them, literally and figuratively, is everything else. The settlements, and the burials, and the maidens, and the field systems, and the souterrains, and the metalwork hoards buried for safekeeping and never recovered. All of that is in the ground, in the landscape, in the record that archaeology can partially read. And under that, deeper still, is the genetic record in the bodies of the people alive in Scotland today. The people who farm the same farms, and fish the same waters, and look at the same sky, and have no idea, for the most part, that they are the biological continuation of something that called itself Pictish, and that carved symbols in stone and terrified Rome. This is what the Picts left behind. Not a dynasty, not a language, not a literary tradition, not even in any recoverable sense a religion, but a physical presence in the landscape, a set of objects that embody a level of care and skill and intention that speaks across 12 centuries, without words, and a biological presence in the population of Scotland that is the most durable legacy of all. They vanished without a trace, in the sense that their culture, their specific identity, their named political entity is gone, but they didn't vanish without a trace in any deeper sense. Their traces are in the ground, and in the stones, and in the blood of the people who live in the places they lived. Those traces don't speak Pictish. They don't read the symbols, but they are there. And the stones are there, and the symbols are there. And the question is still open. Who were they? What were they saying? Why did they terrify everything that came against them for 500 years of recorded history, and almost certainly for thousands of years before that? Why did they choose stone and symbol over text? Why did they disappear the way they did? Not in a decisive military defeat, but in a kind of dissolution, a coming apart of the specific structures that held their specific identity together. What do the symbols mean? We don't know. We are still learning to ask the right questions. The Picts who refused Rome, who used the landscape and the cold and the dark against every invader, who carved their statements in granite, because granite is harder than memory, are asking the questions back at us. Through the stones, through the symbols, through the persistence of the mystery, they are still here, just not in a form we can fully read. Not yet. Let's spend some time now with a question that the mainstream histories tend to sidestep, which is the question of Pictish religion in more detail and what it might tell us about the kind of world the Picts inhabited in their minds. Because the world in your mind is ultimately more important than the world outside it in determining who you are and how you act, and what you are willing to do and what you are willing to die for. The Picts became Christian formally and officially at some point between the 5th and 7th Nast centuries. The exact moment is disputed, and probably varied from region to region, as conversions in this period almost always did. But by the time we have clear Pictish historical records, the Pictish kings are Christian kings. The Pictish churches are part of the broader web of the early medieval church, and the symbol, stones are increasingly incorporating Christian imagery. The magnificent cross slabs of the class sanctum tradition so far so conventional. But what was there before the Christianity, and more importantly what was there underneath the Christianity, or alongside it, or woven through it, in ways that the Church did not fully succeed in displacing? The evidence for Pictish pre-Christian religion is, as you would expect, extremely fragmentary. There are the burials with their grave goods and their ochre and their careful orientation, suggesting some belief in continued existence or significance after death. There are the souterrains with their possible ritual dimensions. There are the symbol stones themselves, some of which were set up before any Christian influence was present, and which were clearly made in the context of some kind of belief system that invested specific symbols with specific meanings. There are the place names, some of which preserve what look like Pictish deity names or sacred site names, though the interpretation of these is uncertain. And then there is a category of evidence that is often dismissed as folklore, but which may contain real historical memory, the traditions connected to specific sacred sites in the Pictish heartland, traditions that were recorded in the medieval period and later, but that may preserve much older associations. The holy wells, for example. Scotland has hundreds of wells that were considered sacred in the peasant pre-Christian period, and that continued to be visited and venerated well into the Christian era, often despite the official disapproval of the Church. Many of these wells are in areas that were once solidly Pictish territory, and the traditions associated with them, the specific qualities attributed to their waters, the specific rituals that were performed at them, the specific saints or spirits who were believed to inhabit them sometimes look like Christianized versions of much older beliefs. The idea of sacred water is ancient and widespread. It's present in the Neolithic, in the Bronze Age, in the Iron Age, across Britain and Ireland and continental Europe. The Romans encountered it everywhere they went, and sometimes incorporated it into their own practices, building temples at sacred springs and connecting the local water deity to a Roman equivalent. In Ireland, the sacred well tradition survived with enough vigor to be extensively documented in medieval and early modern sources. In Scotland, particularly in the former Pictish territories, it survived with rather less documentation, but with equally evident intensity of local attachment. This is important because it suggests that the Pictish religious world, whatever its specific content, was built on a foundation that recognized the landscape itself as sacred, that located divinity in specific physical places rather than in abstract theological concepts, that understood the relationship between the human community and the natural world in terms of a constant negotiation with specific presences in specific places. This is not a primitive understanding. It is a sophisticated and coherent way of organizing the human experience of the natural world, one that has deep roots in how humans everywhere, in the absence of competing frameworks, tend to relate to their environments. The Christianity that the Picts adopted was in many respects not incompatible with this underlying orientation. The early medieval church in the Celtic regions, the church associated with figures like Columba and Ninian and their successors, was itself deeply connected to the natural world. The monastic traditions of the Iona community, of the Irish Church more broadly, placed great emphasis on the natural world as a revelation of the divine, on the sacredness of particular places, on the relationship between the human community and the physical landscape. There was more room in this tradition for the sacred landscape of pre-Christian practice to be reinterpreted rather than rejected, and the evidence of the Pictish symbol stones suggests that some version of this reinterpretation did occur. The springs and wells and rivers and mountains that the pre-Christian Picts had venerated as the homes of specific powers could, within the Christian framework, become associated with specific saints. The specific powers could be reinterpreted as specific divine interventions. The sacred landscape could be maintained, its sanctity acknowledged and preserved, while the theological framework in which that sanctity was understood shifted from something pre-Christian to something Christian. This is a very common pattern of religious transformation in the early medieval period, and there is every reason to think it happened in Pictish territory as it happened everywhere else. But the transition was never complete. The survival of the symbol system, alongside the cross for a century and more, after the formal adoption of Christianity, tells you that the Pictish people were not simply abandoning their pre-Christian visual language in favor of Christian imagery. They were combining them, placing them in dialogue, maintaining their own symbolic vocabulary, even as they added the new vocabulary of Christian art. This is a cultural statement, as much as a religious one. It says, we can accommodate your God and your cross and your visual tradition, but we are also still this. We are still the people of these symbols. Both things are true. The Church in the early medieval period was in most places willing to accept this kind of accommodation, because the alternative, a complete rejection of the new faith by newly converted peoples, was worse. Provided the essential theological claims were accepted, provided the rituals were performed and the clergy maintained, The specific cultural content that accompanied them was negotiable. The result across the Celtic regions of Britain and Ireland was a form of Christianity that was visually and culturally distinct from the Mediterranean Christianity. It derived from a Christianity that had absorbed local artistic traditions, local sacred sites, local ritual practices, and made them its own. In Pictish territory, this produced the great cross slabs, objects that are among the finest achievements of early medieval art anywhere in Europe. The stone on the Black Isle, the rosemary stone, the Shandwick stone, the Glamisman stone. Each of these is a composition of extraordinary complexity, combining the Latin cross, and the interlace, and the biblical scenes, and the Pictish animal ornament, and the Pictish abstract symbols into a visual unity that reflects a specific moment in the life of a specific culture. A moment when the old and the new were being held together in productive tension, each enriched by the presence of the other. These stones are the high watermark of Pictish visual culture. They represent the point at which the Pictish tradition, enriched by Christian contact and by the wide occurrence of early medieval European art, reached its fullest expression. They are in a very real sense what the Pictish tradition had been building toward over 5 centuries, a visual language capable of expressing the full range of human experience, from the abstract and symbolic to the figurative and narrative, from the personal and genealogical to the cosmic and theological. And then, they stop. The tradition ends. The last great cross slabs were probably made in the early 9th century. And after that, the specifically Pictish contribution to the stone carving tradition essentially ceases. What comes after is different. It is recognizably part of the broader Scottish and Irish tradition, but the specifically Pictish elements are gone. The abstract symbols don't appear. The specific animal vocabulary doesn't persist in its Pictish form. The combination that made the Great Cross slabs what they were is dissolved, and what remains is only the Christian half of that combination. This is in its way one of the most precise markers we have for the end of the Pictish world. Not the political end, which is harder to date precisely, but the cultural end, the point at which the living Pictish tradition ceased to be capable of producing new work in its own vocabulary. The symbol stones stop because the people who knew how to make them, who understood what the symbols meant, and how they should be combined and what purposes they served, were no longer there. The tradition had died, and the tradition's death is marked with painful precision by the last stone in the sequence. There are also questions about what the Picts knew about the world beyond Britain, and what connections they had to the wider world of their time that deserve more attention than they usually receive. The early medieval period was, despite its reputation as the Dark Ages, a surprisingly interconnected world. Irish monasteries were producing manuscripts and scholars of European stature. Northumbrian culture was in active dialogue with Rome and with the continental church. Mediterranean trade goods reached Britain through complex chains of exchange. Knowledge and ideas circulated widely, carried by clergy and scholars and merchants and warriors and slaves along the roads and sea routes of the early medieval world. The Picts were part of this world. They were not passive observers of it, not isolated in their northern wilderness, while the important things happened elsewhere. They were trading partners, political actors, military forces, patrons of the arts, participants in the religious networks of the early medieval church. The silver in their hoards sometimes reflects continental influence. The artistic motifs on their stones sometimes show awareness of developments in metalwork and manuscript illumination happening in Ireland and Northumbria. The political events of the Pictish kingdoms were recorded in the Irish annals, which suggests that the Pictish world was significant enough to the Irish chroniclers to be worth tracking. And the Picts presumably were watching the world around them, as well as being watched. They knew about Rome. Its ruins were part of their landscape. They knew about Ireland. They were in constant political and probably commercial contact with Dalriata. They knew about Northumbria. They had fought it and negotiated with it for generations. They knew about the Norse, who began appearing in their northern waters in the late 8th century, and who would soon transform the political map of the islands. They were a people with open eyes, watching the world change around them, and doing their best to navigate it. What they thought about all of this, we don't know. What the Pictish scholars and clergy and poets, whoever they were, made of the complex world they inhabited, what they wrote or sang or said about it, we don't know. The Pictish inner world, the intellectual and emotional and spiritual life of the people, is the thing we most lack and most need to understand the story. And it is precisely the thing that the surviving record denies us. I want to end this part of the journey with something that might seem like a small detail, but that I think is actually quite revealing about the whole Pictish situation. There is a tradition recorded in various Scottish and Irish sources that the Picts had a special relationship with horses, not just as practical animals for warfare and agriculture, though they certainly used them for both, but a deeper, more specific relationship, a cultural and possibly religious relationship with horses that made horse imagery central to Pictish iconography and horsekeeping central to Pictish elite culture. The horses on the Pictish symbol stones are among the most accomplished depictions of horses in early medieval European art. They're shown at the gallop and at the walk, ridden and unridden, in hunting scenes and battle scenes, and in what look like ceremonial contexts. The quality of observation in these depictions, the understanding of equine anatomy, and movement that they reflect, suggests that the people who made them spent a great deal of time watching real horses with real attention. They weren't working from generic horse templates. They were working from specific observations of specific horses. This matters because it tells us something about the Pictish relationship to the natural world. More generally, the Picts were observers. They paid careful attention to the things that mattered to them, and that careful attention shows in their art. The horses are horses because someone watched horses very carefully and cared about getting it right. The fish are fish, and the deer are deer, and the birds are birds for the same reason. The Pictish artist was among other things a naturalist, someone who looked at the world and saw it clearly and rendered what they saw with fidelity. This is a sensibility that is deeply connected to the hunter-gatherer world, to the kind of intimate knowledge of animal behavior and animal form that develops over generations of close observation and deep dependence. Picts were farmers and warriors and craftspeople, not hunter-gatherers in the strict sense. But the sensibility of the attentive observer, the person who knows the animals and the landscape with the intimacy that comes from survival dependence, persisted in their culture in a form that expressed itself in the art. And this perhaps is another thread connecting the Pictish world to the deep past. Another trace of the very long continuity that I have been arguing runs through Pictish culture from the prehistoric foundations to the carved stone monuments of the early medieval period. The people who first settled the northern British landscape 10 or 12,000 years ago, as the ice retreated and the land opened up, were hunter-gatherers. They knew the animals and the landscape with the complete survival-dependent intimacy of people whose lives depended on that knowledge every day. Over the millennia, as farming gradually replaced foraging as the primary mode of subsistence, that intimacy changed its character. It became less about survival dependence and more about cultural continuity, but it didn't disappear. It persisted as a way of seeing, a way of attending to the natural world that expressed itself in art and in ritual and in the specific forms of knowledge that specific communities maintained about their specific landscapes. The Pictish horse carvers were not hunter-gatherers, but they were the cultural descendants of hunter-gatherers in the sense that the way of seeing that produced their art, the careful attentiveness to the specific forms of specific animals, was continuous with a way of seeing that went back to a time when that attentiveness was a matter of life and death. The art changed, the underlying sensibility persisted, and that sensibility, that capacity for attentive, careful, deeply informed observation of the natural world and expression of what is observed through skilled visual representation, is but one of the things that died with the Pictish tradition. It didn't die completely, of course. It persisted in fragments in later Scottish and Irish artistic traditions in the oral traditions that maintained ecological knowledge even after the specific Pictish cultural context that organized that knowledge was gone. But the specific form in which the Picts expressed it, in the symbol stones with their extraordinary animal imagery, was lost. Nobody ever made another Pictish beast. Nobody ever made another horse, in exactly that style, with exactly that quality of observed life. The tradition ended, and with it, ended a specific way of seeing and representing the natural world that was the product of thousands of years of human presence in a specific landscape. This is the cost of the Pictish loss, measured not in political or military terms, but in terms of human vision, human knowledge, human ways of being in the world. The Picts developed over a very long time a specific way of attending to their world, a specific set of skills for representing what they attended to, a specific vocabulary for encoding the meanings they found in what they observed. All of that is gone. The stones tell us it existed. The stones don't let us have it back. The mystery endures because the mystery is real, not manufactured, not inflated for dramatic effect, but genuinely stubbornly present in the gap between what the stones show us and what they mean, between the survival of the form and the loss of the content, between the presence of the descendants and the absence of the tradition they descended from. The Picts are the most interesting unsolved problem in British prehistory, not because they were uniquely dramatic or uniquely powerful, but because they were uniquely themselves and uniquely silent about what that meant. And the silence is permanent, or as I said at the beginning, not yet broken. The stones are still waiting. The symbols are still there. The world they came from is still in the ground under your feet, if you can, standing anywhere in northern Scotland. And the people who study this are still working, still asking the questions, still following the threads that might lead somewhere new. The Picts terrified every civilization that came to Britain, and then they vanished, and they left the stones, and the stones are still asking. What were they saying? We don't know yet, but we're still listening. And somewhere in the stone, in the symbols, in the careful, extraordinary permanent marks of a people who chose granite over vellum, who chose permanence over accessibility, who carved what mattered most to them into the hardest material they could find, and placed it in the landscape they had inhabited. Since before anyone thought to write anything down, the answer is waiting. It has been waiting for 1200 years. It will wait. There is one last thing worth considering as we come to the end of this particular journey into the Pictish world, and it concerns not what happened 1,000 years ago, but what is happening right now. Because the Picts are in a quiet and sometimes surprising way coming back, not as a living culture, not as a reconstructed identity, but as a subject of serious, sustained, scholarly attention that has been building steadily over the last few decades, and that is now at a level of sophistication and ambition that previous generations of researchers did not have access to. The National Museum of Scotland has made the Pictish symbol stones a priority in a way that was not always the case. Conservation work has brought stones in from the open air, where they were deteriorating, and placed them in controlled environments where they will last much longer. Digitization projects have created high-quality three-dimensional scans of every major stone, making them available to researchers anywhere in the world and allowing analysis of surface details that the human eye cannot always detect. The scans have already revealed new details on some stones, faint marks or secondary carvings, that were not visible to earlier researchers working from the physical objects alone. Genetic research continues to sharpen the picture of who the Picts actually were in biological terms. The ancient DNA work sampling genetic material from Pictish burial sites is beginning to build up a dataset that can be compared with modern Scottish populations and with populations elsewhere in Europe, allowing researchers to trace the threads of Pictish descent and to understand more precisely where the Pictish gene pool came from and where it went. This work will not decode the symbols, but it will tell us more about the people who made them, and more about the deep time population history of northern Britain that the Picts represent. Linguistic research, meanwhile, has been making slow but real progress on the question of the Pictish language. The language is known to have existed and is referred to in medieval sources, but very few words of it survive. The best attested words are proper names preserved in king lists and in geographical references, and a handful of inscriptions in the Ogham script, the alphabet originally, developed for the Irish language, that some Pictish stones carry alongside the symbol carvings. These Ogham inscriptions are tantalizingly in a language that is not straightforwardly Irish, suggesting that they really are in Pictish, but they're also not fully legible, and the relationship between Pictish and the other languages of Britain and Ireland is still being worked out. Some researchers argue that Pictish was a Brythonic language related to the Brittonic languages of southern Britain, and therefore a distant ancestor of Welsh. Others argue that it was a completely separate language, not closely related to any other member of the Indo-European language family, which would make it even more unusual, and would strengthen the case for a very deep population continuity behind it. The evidence is insufficient to resolve the debate definitively, but every new piece of evidence, every new name or word that can be identified and analyzed, adds something to the picture. And then there is the question of what the Picts meant to the people who later lived in their land, and what they mean today. This is a question about historical memory and cultural identity, rather than about archaeology or genetics. But it matters, because the way a society remembers or misremembers its past shapes how it understands itself in the present. Scottish national identity in the modern period has been built on a complex foundation that, when includes the Highland clan tradition, the Gaelic heritage, the Presbyterian Church, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and a long history of political relationship and tension with England. The Picts do not feature prominently in this narrative. They are not the founding people of Scotland in the popular imagination, the way that the Celts or the clans or the Covenanters are. They belong to a period that is too old and too obscure to serve as the foundation for a clear national myth. But there is a growing interest, particularly among people in the northeast of Scotland, in recovering and acknowledging the Pictish heritage. In Aberdeenia and Angus and Perth, where the symbol stones are densest and where the sense of connection to the Pictish past is strongest, there is a kind of quiet cultural pride in the Pictish legacy that expresses itself in local museums and local history societies and in the preservation of specific sites. This is not nationalism, at least not in any political sense. It is something more local and more personal, a sense that the specific place you come from has a specific deep history that connects you to people who have been in that place for a very long time. This kind of local historical identity is, in my view, one of the most important and most undervalued forms of cultural continuity. It is not about claiming a great civilization, or asserting a racial identity, or defending a political boundary. It is about recognizing that the place you live in has a depth of human experience embedded in it that goes far beyond your own lifetime, far beyond any narrative that fits neatly into a national history, far down into the ground and the stones and the bones of people who were here when the language you speak didn't exist, and the country you live in hadn't been thought of. The Picts are, among other things, an invitation to think about time in this way. They pull your attention down past the recent centuries, past the medieval period, past the Roman period, into the deep time of British prehistory, where the categories and the deep narratives that organize our normal historical understanding stop working. They are a reminder that the human presence in this island is very old, that the layers of that presence go down much further than the textbooks acknowledge, and that the most interesting parts of that history are in many cases the parts we can read least well. The symbol stones are the most eloquent expression of that deep history. They are the place where the depth becomes visible, where the presence of something very old and very specific and very significant breaks through the surface of the landscape in forms that demand attention even when they refuse explanation. They stand in the rain on the Scottish hills, and they wait, and they have been waiting, and they will keep waiting until someone finds the way to hear what they are saying. And when that happens, if it happens, we will have recovered something that was lost a very long time ago. We will have heard a voice that was silenced 1,200 years ago, speaking across that silence with whatever it was so important to say that it was worth carving in granite. We will have learned something new about what it means to be human in a specific place over a very long time. We will have closed, at least partially, the wound at the center of British prehistory. That day may come, or it may not. The mystery may remain a mystery, but the stones will be there either way, carved by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Placed in landscapes they understood completely, speaking in a language that their makers knew would last, even if the people who could read it didn't. The Picts are gone, the symbols remain, and we are still listening,